Appreciate y'all being here. We are excusing our chair, Vince, who has made the wise choice to be to a family event that takes place today with his daughter. So he's asked, staff have asked me to fill in his chair today, and I'll try to muddle through that. Secretary, would you please take a look?
I will do that. Trustee Gomez. Here. Trustee Russ. Here. Trustee Stewart.
Here.
Trustee Stein.
Here.
President Iadaho.
Yes.
And Trustee Jones Benson. We have a full.
Excellent. Thank you. We do have a very full agenda today with some very important matters that we need to get through. They're all very important, but we will ask where possible for expedited reports to make sure we have time to thoroughly discuss the budget and the tuition increases, which are pretty important stuff today. The first item is a consent item to approve the minutes of the March 21st meeting. Can we get a motion? No amendments or objections to the minutes? Okay, they will stand approved as mailed. I'd like to go into some reports now. First up is the FOAC, School Operations Advisory Council. We just have Richard Bailey here. Richard, thank you for your participation and allowing us to report today. We'll turn to you.
Hi, thank you. Just a couple of comments from what we've been doing in terms of FOAC and looking at the budget. The budget development process has been kind of revamped, which I think has been good. We've gone out to the various departments, particularly on the academic side, and asked for a budget build-up from the bottom, looking at what would happen if we had budget cuts, what would happen if we had budget increases. And I think that process is helpful in making sure that everybody understands what it is that they're getting and what it should be used for. We've also had the opportunity to provide some feedback to President Nagy and to Vice President Fox on the budget initiatives, strategic initiatives that they have planned in the works. Certainly we can't do everything that everybody would like, but we had the opportunity to comment and to rank those initiatives that have been put forward, and then we pass that on to the President and to the Vice President Fox, and they did with it what they did in coming up with the budget that will be presented today. A couple of other things on capital projects. We've got a lot of capital projects going on with the new building coming on and the student rec center improvements that are going to start this summer. So we've looked at a lot of those projects and the costs on those. We've participated in the tuition recommendation that's coming forward today to the board. That has been a very inclusive process, including students, faculty. We've had numerous forums on campus regarding tuition, and that recommendation will be presented today. Things that keep me up at night is enrollment. And I think, you know, with respect to this tuition increase that is being proposed and some other competing things that are out there, you know, there's a limited number of students. Community colleges are now on tap to be offering bachelor's degrees. And that, you know, I'm just concerned about pressures on enrollment from increases in tuition, competing institutions, and how that's going to impact our budget, since tuition is a huge part of our budget, not as big as other institutions, but it is a big part of our budget. So those are, the deficit spending is the other thing, right? I mean, we have a fund balance, and that fund balance we have had some deficit spending this year, and I think we're going to have some proposed in this new budget that will be presented today. That trend can't continue. We can't continue to do that, but hopefully with these initiatives to increase enrollment, which we've allocated monies to strategic enrollment management, hopefully those pay off and that trend will reverse itself. That's the end of my report.
Thank you, Richard.
Any questions?
Any members have questions?
Yeah, I do, Richard. So, this zero-based or bottoms up, what do you think that beyond it's just new, are the deans or the people that are preparing this, are they capable of doing it? Do they have the training to do it? Is there things that we can do to give them examples or templates or?
I think we've done some of that in training them. I think that the biggest issue that they face in dealing with these budget buildups is that so much of our budget is tied up in salary. And on that academic side, so many of our people are tenured, and it's difficult to be flexible in terms of, I can move this and move this when you have those salary components that are just kind of there until we go through and do some kind of program reduction or elimination to do something about that. It's very difficult for them to have much flexibility. So they're dealing with things like travel and professional development and things like that in terms of how they can make those cuts in their budget and not filling positions as they come open, that kind of stuff. But in terms of being flexible enough to say, well, we have too many faculty in this area, unless you get rid of the program, there's just not a lot you can do about that. And it makes it difficult for them to really maneuver in a budget to cut.
I may add to that. Richard is right in terms of the parameters, and our budget office worked very closely with all the budget builders and their staff where needed. They created templates that have improved over the last couple of years. They really worked with them in detail, not just giving the templates, but also working through the process itself whenever they had questions.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Thank you for your report, and thank you for your involvement in the process. I know that can sometimes be cumbersome to engage everyone and make them feel like they have input into a very weighty, complex process. We appreciate your efforts.
Thank you.
Thanks for the feedback as well.
Trustee Stewart, we just had someone join on the line.
The current Stokes person.
Is it?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
The Kermit Stokes.
This is Jenna King. I just wanted to make sure that, yes. Thank you.
Next item up is the second quarter dashboard. Vice President Fox, are you going to present this?
Yeah.
Let me just say parenthetically to members of the committee, the dashboard is something we've been working on for 3 or 4 years now, and it's getting pretty well refined, and I think a very valuable snapshot for us. We've spent a fair amount of time in the past getting verbal reports on the dashboard of this committee. Brian and I have talked about it, and I think going forward we would like to be more dependent on board members reviewing the dashboard in advance. Just taking some time to read through it so that the report of the committee can be a little shorter. That makes sense?
Chairman, I would also like to recognize Stephanie Polk, who has really stepped up as Assistant VP in multiple roles and done a great job.
Thanks, Stephanie.
Thanks. Yeah, I would compliment that. If when things go right, it's Stephanie, and when things go wrong, it's because I've stepped in. She is the brains and the muscle behind a lot of the operation. Thank you. With that, I'll turn it over to Stephanie, who will go pretty quickly through the dashboards. Those are on page 5 of the dockets, and then the quarterly managerial report on page 6. I'll touch really briefly on some of the construction projects, but we've got a busy agenda, so I want to make sure that we're not tying up too much time on these and can focus on more of the substantive areas. That'll turn it over to Steph.
I'm just going to focus on a couple of quick points on the dashboard. In the upper left-hand corner is the E and G fund balance graph. Just wanted to point out a couple of places where there are spikes either up or down in that graph. The first is in August. We talked about this in our last quarterly report. That's due to a timing issue. It's spiking up because we charged students a couple of weeks earlier, which is reflected in that being an August increase. It does trend back down to normal in September. The other point that I wanted to make was in the January spike down there in the green line. That is due to another timing issue. We disperse financial aid to students at the beginning of a term, and then we're reimbursed for that. Typically, that's masked by the allocation from the state. This particular fourth quarter allocation came late, and so it was not masked in this report. So it is an anomaly that we would hope would not happen in the future, but that is specifically due to a timing issue for that graph. We do have 115 days cash on hand, which is a little over 3 months. That's a good place for us to be with three months of operating cash. And then the last graph I wanted to point out is the total student credit hours, because this does play into the management report, which is the next page in your docket. The summer and fall terms were trending up. That gave us some confidence in our tuition projections. But then in the winter term and spring term, it stagnated a bit and dropped a little bit in the spring term, which means that we had a bit of a miss on our net tuition revenues due to that softness in our enrollment. Were there any questions on the dashboard?
So sorry, Stephanie, the enrollment drop.
Mm-hmm.
You know, Brian and I were talking about this a little bit yesterday, and I was asking Brian if there was any investigation into why we were losing students. You know, I know we've been very focused on upping enrollment, but it doesn't do us any good to get a bunch of people in the fall and then lose them.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if you guys are planning on doing anything about that.
Actually, we are looking into it very carefully. It did not happen everywhere. It happened in a couple of places.
Okay.
At least in one instance, there are some unique global events that is causing this, partly because of the way we offer our classes. Two of the countries that sent a lot of students to one program, I just heard yesterday they have made a decision not to promote students coming here because we teach a lot more online. So the departments have to look into rebalancing faculty engagement, faculty presence in our multiple sites, and then get to a different point. So we are actively looking into those things.
Okay. Can the revenue model of the online services be adjusted to help mitigate that impact? It's not real strong the way it is now, but I don't know what the opportunity is either.
Yes. So I think, and I wish Erica Beth, our enrollment management person, also is the dean of our online side. We're here to talk about that. There are opportunities for us to grow our online presence. Some of that has been cannibalizing kind of current enrollments. So the issue for us is reducing down the fixed cost component of that. So some of that's been increasing the increase in the marginal cost, maintaining the fixed cost with some incremental revenue, but the net of that is not a positive net. But I think there is room for us to grow in online. It's going to be in some niche programs. You know, we're going to end up being a few large players for most of online. Then it's what are the niche programs that will separate us from others.
I'll go into the general fund monthly report, which is the table that is the next page in your docket. Just a few quick points on this. As I noted before on the dashboard, we did have a little bit of a miss on our net tuition revenue due to the decrease in enrollment that we had projected to be happening this spring. So between the adjusted budget and the year-end forecast, we're missing our net tuition revenues by about $1.5 million. That's offset a little bit in the other revenue section of that report. That's primarily due to the OMEC or R&D revenue that comes in, but that is pass-through revenue. It comes into the general fund and goes right back out again to projects. So it doesn't really help the bottom line there. In the labor forecast, we are projecting that we will be lower than the mid-year adjusted budget that was approved by the board in January by about $400,000. That could fluctuate a little bit depending on hires and vacancies and that sort of thing, but we're pretty confident in that number being accurate for us through the end of the year. The direct expenses we expect to be under our mid-year adjusted budget by about $500,000. That one is a little bit more flexible, primarily due to the timing of when the FY19 equipment budgets were awarded to academic departments. That happens in the spring term. There's only a few months then for those academic departments to spend those funds. So depending on timing of when they can get equipment in, what type of equipment they're purchasing, some of that funding may leak into the beginning part of the next fiscal year. So that's where we're a little soft on that number, but we do anticipate it'll be about $500,000 that will be under the mid-year adjusted budget. All of those things together mean that the change in fund balance will be about $2.2 million in the negative for the fiscal year, which is about where the original board adopted budget that was adopted last spring had us sitting, but it was also a miss from our mid-year adjusted budget that we brought to the board in January. And that is primarily due to the tuition miss that we had on enrollment and our projections at that time. Any questions on that report? Hearing none. I'll just make a couple of quick points on the cash flow chart that is the next page in your docket. We made a couple of adjustments here at Trustee Jones's urging that were excellent points for us. We've changed some of the methodology, which will make us more accurate moving into the future on this particular report. The big thing to note here on this report is that as we go into the summer months, we don't expect to have any more revenue coming in from the state or from tuition, or at least not significant dollars, but we are going to continue to have some of our fixed costs around labor, utilities, that kind of thing. So we generally see getting closer to our 2-month operating amount in the summer months that will, again, pick back up as we get funding from the state again in the next fiscal year and tuition at the beginning of the next academic year.
So 2 pieces here. We started these cash flow projections as we began cash flowing capital projects in advance of the state selling bonds. And so miscommunication on my part with the business office. They've been focused on getting us through July on that, which is when the state will sell the bonds. And so these forecasts will continue on kind of either a 12 or an 18-month rolling. We're working out right now whether we think we can be accurate enough at 18 months. So I know there's not a lot of forecast left in this. So there will be the next time you see it. And I did want to point out in the dotted line has been the forecast. You see 2 big misses there. And this is where Trustee Jones wanted us to focus on. Why are we missing? Those are essentially in-out transactions where we will float financial aid for 5 days at the beginning of terms before they're reimbursed from the federal government. And so our model was assuming that there was no net impact in that, but because of timing differences, those were hitting at the end of the month. So that's why we were off. You can see where there would have been another spike in March, April timeframe, and we're dead on. So our methodology at this point is pretty solid. So we expect that to move forward positively. I'll just glance at a couple of capital projects real quick. The capital dashboard begins on page 8. We want to dig through those. I just wanted to say of the projects that are major projects going over the summer, the Cornet Phase 1 is now complete. We're moving into the west side, which is the mechanical engineering side. And Phase 2 will begin. Part of it's already begun with the outside of the building and the roof replacement. But the Phase 2, the south wing, kind of the middle of the U shape in that building, will begin this summer and is expected to be done. Gosh, I shouldn't have started that sentence. I think my recollection says an 18-month construction period. So that would put us towards the end, kind of December 2020 or early 2021. We will begin, as soon as school is out, we will begin several projects, including the Student Rec Center. We're finalizing permits right now and are working on a final gross net price with with the contractor. That's MoDOT Construction, which is a local firm. The CET project, we're working on permits with the city. We expect to have an early work package with City County. We expect to have an early work package to begin moving earth in August. So August, September, we'll start disturbing a lot of earth, and then we've got various kind of smaller infrastructure projects going throughout the summer. So it will be busy if you're on campus. There's going to be a lot of holes in the ground, so pay attention as you're walking around. And with that, I'll conclude the dashboard report unless there are other questions.
Brian, on these, the projects, and you expected to make some pretty good headway over the summer, I would imagine.
Yeah, so we will on the infrastructure type projects. So we've got a lot of some sewer drains and electrical projects. Those will be done over the summer, closed out. We like to have a date of either September 1, usually a September 1 for substantial completion, and then final full completion by September 15th. So we go fast and furious for about 3 months.
Much later than that, the ground's frozen. So.
What was that?
Much later than that, the ground's frozen.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, which we ran into that last year on a couple of things. We've got some dirt piles with grass on them now, so I'm a much happier camper. The Student Rec Center, we will be getting a lot of thanks actually to our medical imaging department, who we're using one of their rooms as swing space for our rec center over next fall and winter terms. So we're going to have weight machines and treadmills in the Dow Center for a couple of months. So our students have a gym. That project is going to, we'll fill in the pool. The first thing that will happen is we're going to pump a whole lot of slurry into the pool and allow it to cure for about 6 months. Then we'll cover it.
It takes that long, huh?
It's a lot of concrete, yeah.
I guess so.
That's the hard part on that project is cure time on the concrete. Yeah. So that one will extend through June of next year, through March of next year. We expect to move in over spring break and have the new rec center going. But summertime's busy, and then come September, we're fast and furious to button things back up for start of class.
Thank you.
Any other questions, dashboard related?
Maybe for the record, I want to recognize Tom Dare, our facilities director, who has done a fabulous job of doing projects on time, under budget. We are very fortunate to have him on our staff.
Absolutely. I would encourage folks, as you're leaving campus today, to drive to the Circle, and up at the top you'll see the softball field. If you haven't been on campus for a while, we've got brand spanking new turf field, largely financed from a donor, the Stillwell family. I mean, it's just an incredible asset. And our softball team, I think, finished 8th in the country this year. They had a really strong performance. So it's great to see new assets, new things, shiny, and to have our students enjoying them.
Yeah, I drove it yesterday. That was our old football practice field. That's what it used to be. It looks gorgeous.
It's beautiful.
I mean, it is a great field. So
it's one of the probably at least top 10 fields in our classification across the country.
Yeah, it's a great field.
That's a heck of an asset.
With the rec center moving into the Dow building, the basement of Dow is pretty quiet most days anyways, but are we expecting an academic impact by having athletes, showers, sports equipment, many things parading through the basement?
So we don't expect, there's really nothing down there in sort of that wing.
Yeah, it's very quiet.
We don't, though there are actually, I think there's one shower for male, female, and both of those. Okay. Don't expect that those will be used. The showers in the rec center will continue to be operational, so if folks want to use those facilities, those are still there. Those won't be touched. There's going to be some clanks and whatnot, so I can't imagine. There's going to be some. I imagine there will be some minor impact and probably some complaining with it. But I do really want to thank the medical imaging folks who have been very willing to make something work.
It'll be nice to have that space finished and fully functional.
Yep.
Thank you, Stephanie and Brian. Appreciate the report and good work on that. Moving on to item 3.3, we're slated to have an update on the ethics hotline and the annual report. I'm going to ask that Kermit Stokes include this report in item 4.1, the annual risk assessment audit reports. And with that, we'll move to that item, 4.1. I think we have, yes, welcome. You hear us okay?
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. So yeah, so thank you for your time today. My name is Trevor Campbell. I'm a manager over your engagement at the internal audit. On the line, we also have Janet Kane, who's another manager with our firm. She's working out of our big office and working on a project right now. And then Haley Lyons is our partner, and unfortunately she was planning to call in today, but she had some travel issues and is unable to join us. But so she sends her apologies, but we'll continue on without her. Looks like you've got my slide deck there, so I'll just kind of start moving through and give you an update on kind of what we've done and where we're headed in the next year and beyond. So our agenda will go over kind of where the audit projects are from this year. We'll give you an update on kind of their status. We're moving into completion phase on the two bigger projects. Although we don't have the reports finalized yet, but we're getting very close to that, and we expect to be there by year end. Then we'll do an update on the fraud, waste, and abuse at the hotline, as we just mentioned. And then we'll talk about kind of the multi-year audit plan, which I'll cover more when we get that section. But kind of a revamp the process that we put into place, along with help from management and the board yourself, so that we can kind of try to get more audits in and be more efficient and have a longer view, working off of a lot of the work that's done over the last 3 years. And then we'll cover kind of where some of the prior audits from the last 2 years are. We do a check back on those, and so we'll touch on that too. So moving on to kind of the first part on the next slide of our audit project update. If anybody has questions along the way, please, I can't see anybody, but please feel free to just speak up. I'll take a pause so you have a chance to ask anything if you have questions. So the two big audits we did this year, the first one was the OMIC, and as I said, that's in process right now. Everything's going really well on that. I think we've got some good information that we'll be able to provide. We went out there in February to Scappoose and kind of spent a couple days on site working with management there and doing a lot of interviews, gathering information. We've then done some detailed testing around a few areas, which we wrapped up last kind of month, and now we're in the phase of kind of putting all of those thoughts together, working along with management there to make sure that any issues that we might see and recommendations that we might suggest are reasonable, getting their feedback to make sure that anything that kind of comes from that can be implemented and has good, will have a good positive impact on the organization and help kind of protect Oregon Tech in the process. So we're anticipating in early June, so being that this is the one of the last days of this month, sometime in the next probably couple weeks is when we're hoping to have a report that will be ready for the board to look at for that. So, like I said, I don't know that there's any emergency issues to address that we need to bring up now, but I do think got some good information to kind of provide some better efficiencies and process improvements that'll be very beneficial to both that effort and Oregon Tech as a whole. So the second one, we did athletic fiscal review. We were on site out at Oregon Tech. We were up at that very amazing softball field that was just being spoken about on one of the last games of the season there. And I can certainly attest to it's as nice as any field I've seen. So, and the view can't be beat, of course. So, so we were there in April doing some kind of cash handling things. Along with that, we're looking at these other bullet points here on the slide. Some policy and procedures, as always. Also looking into kind of revenue producing contracts, use of donor endowed funds, travel expenses, and as I said, cash handling. These are all things that are common issues for universities and things in the athletics department. And we're just kind of looking to see if there's any way that controls around those can be tightened to make sure that that everything goes smoothly. We are kind of in the process of drafting our report. I think we are through with most, if not all, of our testing on that. And I anticipate we'll have that report also ready by the end of the month. So I think both of these should be complete before the end of this fiscal year, is my anticipation right now. Does anybody have any questions on either of these audits? Great. We'll move on to the next item, which is the update on the fraud, waste, and abuse ethics hotline. So one thing we added this year in kind of for mutual purpose, you may see in your board packet, we put together a report. It's only 4 pages in total, so not long, but a report on kind of the last 3 years of data of the ethics hotline. And in addition to what you see on the slide here, which is kind of, the open cases and stuff, we are now at a point where we've got enough data that looking back over the last 3 years that we can start to kind of quantify and qualify some other areas. And so that report that we put together just kind of shows some information that's kind of interesting in relation to what kind of allegations are tending to be the most common and what the reporting sources are. So please look at that. If you have any questions at any time, we're always available to answer more. Over currently, in this last year, these are on fiscal years here, there's been 6 reports that have come in. That's very similar to what it was last year as well. 5 of those have been resolved. 1 is currently open, and it was only submitted at the end of last month. It typically takes, I would say, depending on the seriousness of the issue, 1 to 2 months to kind of investigate and wrap up a case with a conclusion. So that's not I don't think that currently open one is not delinquent in any way. It's just mid-process. And this report also we think is a good response to the external audit comment that kind of mentioned the audit or the fraud, waste, and abuse ethics hotline. So this is kind of a combined effort that, along with kind of some increased communication that Brian is putting in place with staff. Now this report, we think, also kind of formalizes a presentation to the board. We'll plan to do this annually, and just to kind of complete that loop and give you guys kind of all of the information that we really have that might be meaningful. So that is where we're at on the fraud, waste, and abuse line. Moving on to the next section of our agenda, I want to talk about the multi-year audit plan. So we talked about this at the last, a couple of the last board meetings where we called in as well. And really the try to, now that we've been engaged for 3 years, as I said, we've got a better feel for your organization. I think we're starting to be kind of more integrated into the culture of the university. We have, we're on site, 2 or 3 times a year at least, typically, and starting to kind of get to know people and things like that. And so we wanted to try to, you take advantage of a lot of those relationships and build some more efficiencies into our audit planning process. And so basically, instead of, we're kind of using all of the information we've gathered, and now the intent is that we can plan ahead for what we put together here is a 3-year audit plan that is something that we can just begin working on right away. So the hope is that at the end of today or in the very near future, the board can kind of approve this plan, and then effectively we can start auditing for next year right away. The 2019-20 plan will kind of be set for what we're going to intend to do, and then we've got tentative plans for the next 2 years. And the way we kind of plan to use this whole format is, we'll start working through. We've already worked with Brian and Vince to kind of nail down the 2019 and 20 audits. And then as we work through those and as time permits, the following years are just the audits that we'll continue working on. So should we wrap up things early on the 19-20 plan, we'll just roll right into the next year and start working on those. Every year we'll plan to do a kind of targeted update where we'll interview, just a small handful of people in management and on the board to make sure that there's no major changes that we should be aware of. There's always room that we could put a new audit in, substitute something out if something major arose. So that leaves us with that flexibility, but to the extent that things are kind of moving forward as expected, now we can kind of open up the entire calendar to audit and try to get more return for you guys in terms of oversight. So that full report you should have. It's similar to kind of what you've seen in the past in terms of our audit plan. The final pages kind of plot out 40 potential audits that we have kind of identified as potential areas of need at some point for the university. And I think over the next 3 years, we would hope to cover somewhere in the range of 12 to 15 of those. And then again, we reevaluate and continue working forward after that. So does anybody have questions in relation to just kind of the overall view, or if you had a chance to look at that audit, that kind of bigger packet? If you have questions on that, please bring them up. The plan for 2019 to 2020, that first part is effectively already done. That was our kind of update this year. The big change, like I said, in moving to this format, in the past, it's typically taken, probably close to 120 hours to do, 120, maybe even 150 hours to do a full risk assessment. So cutting this down significantly opens up the room for another audit. The fraud, waste, and abuse, we typically, somewhere between 20 or so hours that we typically spend on that. Most of our work is just to be the kind of go-between to receive information and then forward it to the appropriate parties, which is typically the university's general counsel for follow-up. We assist if needed, although that hasn't been something that's been required so far. And then we communicate back through the hotline to those that submit when a case is resolved. The prior audit follow-up, which we'll touch on in a second. Every year we kind of follow up on past audits to see if plans of resolution have been followed or if they've changed in some way. So I'll cover on that. And then the audits that we have planned for next year, currently, the big one, and if you may recall, we try to identify a mix. So try to touch on one or two major potential issues for the university each year, and then we also try to touch on one or two kind of smaller issues, things that would never be identified as a major risk, but that are good oversight and create kind of a good culture of internal controls and process improvement. So kind of our two bigger projects are the sponsored projects and grant administration, where we'll be looking at kind of the handling of grants post-award and making sure that kind of all of the rules and laws are being followed and that things are being accounted for and handled in accordance with the grant outlines. So that'll be kind of our first major one. We'll also look at Title IX. This is one that we've kind of had on the docket potentially for a while, but as the university's been kind of putting in a more kind of formal Title IX process and coordinator, we wanted to give time for that to kind of get implemented fully, and so now feels like a good time to take a look and see how that process is going. On the next slide, we've got two others. One, housing and residence life. This is part of our kind of annual plan to just look at one of the auxiliaries of the university, one of the units that handles a lot of their own kind of revenue and expense tracking and does some cash handling or things like that. So, in the past we're doing the athletics, we've done the student health center and the telecom. So this is just another one of those that we try to this is one where we branch out and try to get good contact around a variety of units in the university. And then the final one will be the academic agreements and looking at kind of the handling of, a lot of that will be looking at the handling of students moving from high school into the university setting and making sure that those relationships and contracts and things like that are being handled correctly. So that's our plan for this next year. And then, as I said, that full report shows the intended plans for the years after that, although they're not in the slides here. And then finally, the last slide we've got is looking back at the prior audits. So, as I said, we look back at the things that we've completed and we try to follow up to see if things have been implemented as management had intended, or if maybe those plans have changed, and that'll be something that we communicate to the board. We're currently in contact working with financial aid office, business affairs, and the student health center on, I think combined between those, there's 4 audits that had things that were going to be improved. We are planning to, once we get follow-up on all of those, we'll basically put that together into one report that will be, here's the kind of completed loop on all those audits, and we're anticipating having that report to the board sometime this summer, and it'll kind of outline if the steps are completed and if there was a change, what those were, and so on. So that's where we're at on those. And then the one other is the faculty workload management, where because of all of the changes with that kind of process and department, there's still kind of working through the management response phase of that, and we will plan to communicate back to the board as soon as we have kind of more complete information and expectations on where that's heading. So that kind of concludes where we're at, where we're looking to go in this kind of upcoming year and beyond. Does anybody have questions or comments I can address?
Trevor, thanks for the thorough report. Questions from members of the committee?
Yeah, Trevor, I had one on the risk ranking, the heat map kind of looking thing. So how do you determine the likelihood and the impact? Specifically, I was looking at the disaster recovery.
Yeah. So we try to evaluate that. You see that big chart page 7 and page 8. And so when we look at the likelihood and the impact, we try to consider kind of all of those areas. So some things, as you know, have a financial impact, but some things don't. Some things have a safety impact. And so each of those things, we kind of try to step back and think like, okay, what's the potential impact on some of the most serious categories that this potential area could address. And then with the likelihood, there's kind of a variety of ways that you could look at that. But I kind of look at it as, okay, once I've identified what the potential impact is, what's the likelihood that that impact is going to occur? So that's kind of the balance. And it is a little bit more of an art than a science. We try to follow a very, we start with a very mathematical process, and then also try to look and just see if it's the kind of field test for that. And then once we've kind of done that initial work, we give it to Brian and Vince, and Dr. Nagy also often looks at it, and we get their feedback as well. And often there's changes where it's like, well, I think this should go up here and over here. But really, that heat map is hopefully just a useful tool that kind of pinpoints, where the kind of most significant areas are to focus on, so that over time we're getting good audit coverage. We're not ignoring things that could be major, but we're making sure to just kind of get a good mix of projects. I don't know if I didn't specifically address your one question. Does that answer, or do you want more specifics on the one that you were asking about?
No, I think I understand exactly how you're doing it. A lot of subjective, but there is some data in there. It's just in my work life that I go through, I tend to see the same sort of reaction around this disaster. I always say it's like getting hit by a meteor. But I'm just concerned that we've got something that I don't know if it's that likely so high, and it kind of shifts attention away from other things that we should be actually auditing. You know what I mean? But if you've got Dr. Nagy and VP Fox in there, I feel confident that they're adjusting as required. So.
Yeah, and the other thing is, as you can see from our kind of audit plan, is we don't just start with the number one and say, well, that's the highest risk, so we're going to audit that. We try to coordinate, and this is where Brian, the management is really useful, is helping to coordinate the timing of the audit. So even though, say, like disaster recovery might be, higher on the list, they do really help identify, well, we can see that that's a potential high risk, but we're still going to focus on these other areas now as either low-hanging fruit, or just the timing of looking at one of these other areas isn't quite right yet. We know that say there's some things that are high risk, but it'll be better to look at them next year because of a certain project that's going to be in action or something at that time. So we do try to use, in planning the audits, we try to not just be drawn straight towards the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5s, but really coordinate the efforts as the most efficient and best process for the university.
Okay, thank you.
I would say too, the plan, it's never really cast in stone. And so while we need to provide Kermit Stokes direction if we're going to deviate, there is the opportunity to kind of on the fly say, well, something's happened, we need to take a closer look at this other area that was anticipated later.
Okay.
So there is some flexibility to
okay.
do that. Trace, do you have a question? Are there any other questions for Trevor about the plan? Either the 1920 plan or the 3-year, multi-year?
I do have a question. Do I have a conflict of interest with my department being audited and the
report out to the board.
It is the academic agreements department.
No?
Okay, you're not.
Dave,
I don't have a concern, she's just approving the audit overall.
question? Thanks for asking.
Just making sure.
Yes. Up front. Any other questions? Do we need to approve both the 1920 plan and the multi-year plan? Okay. We'll entertain a motion for the 1920 plan as presented in the multi-year plan.
Make that motion.
Thank you. Is there any further discussion? Hearing,
We have, because of the other contractual elements with Kerner Stokes, the plan is one, who is doing it is other. I just want us to be consistent with what we are doing. So,
I think approving the plan, we have a contract extension question that will come up next. So I think approving the plan is good, but there's some other kind of questions there.
arguably cart before the horse, but
A little bit,
we'll
yeah.
see come up a little bit here in a minute,
Yeah.
probably. I will say Vince has had a lot of the input into the development of the plan, had the chance to review it beforehand, and he concurs with it. I got the peek under the tent preparing for this, and it looks good to me too for the time being. So. Hearing no other discussion, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Are there any opposed? Okay, it's unanimous. Trevor, thank you again for your presentation and for the reports. Appreciate it.
Thank you for your time. We always appreciate the chance to kind of speak with you and give you updates on what we're doing and where we're at.
Good deal. Okay, can we excuse Trevor now, or? All right, we'll let you sign off, Trevor. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
thank you, Trevor.
Do you want to, Brian, take 4-2 or 4-3?
We can do the 4-3 since it's.
So, as referenced, the internal audit contract that we're currently under will be ending. And we have a decision to make about renewing that contract with Kermit Stokes. And I think the recommendation is for a 1-year renewal at this time, is that right?
Yeah, it is. We initially had the contract that we've had with Kermit Stokes is started out as a 1-year with 1-year extension, so we have kind of the option to extend on those. And this one, that actually the last option to extend ended, so we need to amend the contract to do that. In discussions with Dr. Nagy and Chair Jones, Delegate and the board secretary, really thought that it made sense for us to extend for a year, continue the services as are, and then in the fall come back to this committee with a discussion of the kind of scope and scale of services for internal audit. And I think there's a lot of value in the risk assessment. There's a lot of value that Kermit Stokes brings with a wider distribution of skills than we would have, or a bigger bench than we would have. But it's worth us, that we're 3 going into 4 years on with their contracted, take a step back and evaluate, what is the kind of field of services or the field areas that they're engaged in.
So the fee structure for that 1-year extension is in place as a continuation of the contract?
It is. It's a continuation with, I believe, either a 2 or a 3% inflation. So it's very
typical.
Exactly. So the staff recommendation is for this committee, because internal audit and the next motion, external audit, both report to this to the board directly. That this body, if it so chooses, could make a motion to extend the contract for a year, and then we'll take care of it.
Any questions about the action being contemplated?
Brian, is there a financial advantage of doing a longer term?
I don't think there is.
Okay.
I think when we come back in the fall, if we continue with it, external, internal auditor, there we negotiate the contract scope and hours, but there's not a price advantage to going longer.
Okay.
In the contract as written is a not to exceed, so we can mid-year choose if we wanted to drive down their hour use. We could pull an audit off and recapture some of that value. So we're billed on an hourly basis from them.
Okay, so the recommendation is to extend the current contract for 1 year under its current terms and then reevaluate a multi-year plan at some point in the fall. We'll entertain any motion.
I'll make that motion.
Okay,
Second.
then moved and seconded that we extend Kermit Stokes under the current agreement for 1 year. Any discussion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, and that's an action we can take. It's not a recommendation to the board. Is that correct? All right, let's go back to 4.2, which is a discussion of a contract for financial audit and this federal single audit.
Yeah, so this is very similar to the last item. Clifton Larson Allen, which is a national accounting chain or national accounting firm. They have I'm going to bet 40 or 50% of the higher ed market. They've got a couple of pretty clear specializations. We've been with them for 3 years, and their contract similarly is up. And so the question for us is whether to extend that, and if so, over what time. We feel, again, in discussions with Chair Jones, with Sandra, Dr. Nagy, and myself, feel like it makes sense to extend the contract for Clifton Larson Allen for a 3-year term, which is the original length of the contract. Something that we discussed with Clifton Larson Allen and others is, sticking with the same accounting firm over longer periods of time. And we feel both it's standard practice to be in the 5 to 7 years with an auditor. After that, you want to, at the very least, rotate partners to ensure that you're getting kind of wide partners and teams, so you're getting kind of a wide distribution of folks looking through your books. We've got good pricing there. I've verified with the other institutions that are at or about our size, and the pricing from Clifton Larson Allen lines up with theirs. They have offered inflationary increases, so the same 2 to 3% increases on an annual basis. That's a fixed fee, not an hourly basis contract. We also, a reason that we think it's important to stick with the same audit firm is we've had a pretty significant amount of transition in staffing in our business affairs controller's office. And I think there's a lot of value in having the same auditors who have a pretty good sense of our control environment, our financial environment, to actually help us through some of that transition. So adjusting auditors, you go through a lot of work in that process, and I think some consistency will be of value there. And we've got a good team, so it's both staff's recommendation and a discussion with the chair of this committee to extend that contract for 3 years.
Any questions about extension of the audit relationship with Clifton Larson Allen? Hearing none, we'll entertain a motion to recommend extension for 3 years.
Second.
Okay, moved and seconded. Any further discussion, comments? Hearing none, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
And any opposed? Passes. Is that a decision or a recommendation?
It's a decision.
It's a decision. Within the purview of the audit committee. Okay, thank you. Now we're going to move to docket item 4.4, which is a recommendation of the board to approve tuition and mandatory fee changes and authorizing staff to forward the recommendations to HEP. As you've seen in reviewing your packet, this is a very difficult year for all of the universities with the current funding picture in the state and management of the expense structure, particularly in times of change in higher ed and that growth phase that we're trying to be in. There's been a pretty thorough process that we've gone through internally, and I just want to take a moment to thank both of our ASOIT presidents for being so engaged in the process, providing strong feedback and guidance and kind of shepherding it for us. I know we're all going to be very sensitive to this particular recommendation. And as Richard referred to earlier, we're going to be concerned about potential impacts on enrollment with such an increase. But as I think we'll hear, the consequences of other actions are also pretty dire. So with that, Brian, are you going to lead off?
I will. And I'd like to introduce our student body presidents, maybe give them a second. I know most of the folks on the committee have met them, but good to hear where you're from, what your major is, your name, all that.
Sure. Hi, so I'm Jonathan Nguyen. I'm from the Portland campus. I drove down here just to be here, so it's glad. So I'm super glad to kind of be here with all of you. I'm studying IT and I'm a senior, so I'll be graduating this fall. So I'm super excited to kind of wrap up my year and
Jonathan, would you also want to say where you came from to attend Oregon Tech?
Oh, sorry.
Where did you go to high school?
Oh, so I went to high school in Wilsonville High School, and then so I'm a transfer student from PCC. So I came from there, and I know we have a lot of transfer students up in Portland. So yeah.
Thanks for making the drive.
Yeah, thank you.
Appreciate it.
Hi, my name is Jinmin. Glad to be here as well. My hometown's back in Malaysia, Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, and so I'm an international student here. I'm currently a junior as a dual major in software engineering and mathematics.
You're going to go into NECOP.
Yes, leaving soon.
Excellent. Where are you going?
Up to the Portland area.
Which company?
CamGuide Health Solutions.
Okay, yeah.
Trustee Starr has been very active in NECOP.
From Boeing, yeah. So, and I think we have 8 or 10 this year, so, in Portland. So.
When before we get in, really want to thank both Jonathan and Junman and the rest of the members of the committee, including Richard, for their help in this process. This really is kind of the most both extensive and I think important and collaborative process that we have, and it's one that's hard and fraught by nature. I think asking students to help set tuition is it's just a lot to ask, but our students come to it with thoughtfulness and maturity that is just every year incredible to me. So we'll kind of split up this presentation into a couple of pieces and allow our students to talk, provide an overview of the process, who's involved. I'll talk through some of the finances, and we'll hear about the budget next. So some of this is, we'll hear a part of it now and a part of it when we talk about the budget, but know that both of those are very much intertwined. And then we'll follow up, because there's a lot of regulatory component to the tuition approval if we exceed 5%, which the recommendation is to do so. There are a lot of kind of pieces that the state's coordinating commission and that the legislature has laid out that we need to follow. So kind of close this out, walking through how it is that we've met those pieces, and much of that is outlined in the docket item. So with that, kind of hand it over to Jonathan and
So basically, for the TRC, it's made up of a number of different members from all different parts of staff, faculty, students, and so the goal is to look back at the budgets and look at what the historical tuition setting has been in the past, and try to base it off that and see and find a balance where our tuition is still affordable for students, as well as maintaining the quality of education from this institution. And so the biggest part of TRC's role is just to really deliberate and analyze all these numbers and look at different scenarios, and then provide a formal report to Dr. Nadi. And then from there, we have ASYT's role, and so we host campus forums to solicit student feedback to see what they think of possible scenarios. And moving on, we send these formal recommendations to Dr. Nadi, and then which comes up to the Board of Trustees here. And so, go next. And so this is our charter. We try to focus on very important things, as you can see our goal is there. And so we look at, for example, recommending tuition and the tuition mandatory fee rates to the president. And so, as written here, the committee is comprised of 6 students representing both campuses and appointed by the ASYT presidents, as well as the FOAC chair and at least 2 administrators. And so we always look at how the tuition can, we always document how the tuition's impact on students, and we look at the necessity of the increase in achieving the mission of the university. And so, if you go to the next slide. And so, as you can see here from the membership, it's definitely made up of a number of different, a variety of different people. Actually, a lot of these, I don't know if you can see that too clearly, but roughly 6 or 7 of those are students, and so we make up a big part of the voice on the committee.
Juman, were all the students actively engaged, attending all the meetings and participating?
Most of us.
Including meetings at 7 a.m. and meetings at 5 p.m. on a Friday. So,
Let's go to the next slide. These are our guiding principles. This is what we really consider and we look at as we go through our process. And so we try to revisit these every meeting to make sure that we're still on track and try to follow what we've set out to do. And so this is our calendar. So we started back in I think back in late November, where we first started, and we've been going through I think 7 months now. Largely, it's been a long process. I understand that in the past it's always been done, this tuition committee has always been done around March, and so with the uncertainty from the state legislator, we've kind of pushed it back. But this gave us more time to really deliberate and look at the scenarios that we put out.
Great. So the next piece, I'll provide a relatively brief overview of the budget and some of the information that we had in the development of it. And it's important to note some of the kind of budget figures were preliminary, and that we're doing 2 things of the same, or maybe 3 things: trying to figure out where the state budget would be, trying to build our budget, and working through a tuition process and trying to be as clear and transparent in the tuition process while we're juggling the other 2. And so I really appreciate the committee and the students bearing with us through what has been a bit of a frustrating go. And so I do want to acknowledge that some of those budget numbers are preliminary, will be a little bit different than what you see later today. But I thought it was important for this group to see essentially the same presentation that our students have seen in budget forums, that the tuition committee has seen. So I think being consistent, and even where you have to caveat, it's a little bit old information, is better to provide transparency to this group as it is to our students. So just a little bit of background, something that our students are always interested in is, where does tuition go? And so just a high-level overview of the funding for our institution. About 50% of our revenue, this is taken from our 2019 forecast budget, so this is where we expect to end this year. About 50% of our funds come from tuition and fees, about 45% from state funding, about 5% is other. So kind of some of that's OMIC, some of that's small kind of other pieces. It tells us we are half tuition. That's our bread and butter. That number has been growing over time. So where does that go? And that's on the right-hand side. The biggest bulk of that, 49% of it goes to labor, another 23% to benefits. So, roughly 70% of our total expenses go to people. And we heard about that earlier today from FOAC Chair Bailey about how do we manage our budget and working through that. About 20% to supplies and services, and then varying small percents to debt service, utilities, other kind of small things. Within supplies and services are a lot of kind of short-term capital assets. So those will be classified as capital and on the financial statements. Our expenses are those really routed through supplies and service categories. So that includes computer equipment replacements, even if some of those are capitalizable. So if that capital number seems small and the supplies number seems big, that's why. But key piece there is its benefits and labor is the largest components of our budget. So where we started, we had a ton of variability in where the state budget is. And because the state funding makes up such a large component of our budget, if you assume the expense is flat or know that there's going to be pressure on that to grow, and we've got 2 revenue categories, one of which is tuition, one of which is state appropriations, we know that there's a pretty clear hydraulic there. State appropriations is going to be flat or shrinking. Then we either need to be cutting expenses, using reserves, or growing the tuition base to manage. The governor started out the year with kind of a twofold recommendation, and that's what the GRB is, Governor's Recommended Budget. One recommendation was flat funding for the PUSF, the Public University Support Fund, where our dollars are divvied up among with the other institutions. And what we did as a committee was look and say, okay, what would that mean in either if we just ate that all out of reserves, or if we ate that all out of tuition, just to give you kind of the edge cases and then know that we were going to work between those. That would be, and the number is actually a little bit higher as we honed our budget in, but early in the year, our view was that would be about a $7.6 million use of fund balance. It's about 10% of our, it'd be taking our fund balance down 10%, or about half of our operating reserves, or increasing tuition by 30%. None of those particularly palatable. At the best case scenario, the HEC had laid out a plan to make major investments in higher education, which would include $186 million worth of new funding for the public universities in Oregon. Even in that case, there are enough cost pressures coming largely from PEB and PERS, and we'll talk about those in a moment. Enough cost pressures that we still wouldn't break even off of that given the distribution. So even in the best case scenario, you've got some room to close the gap.
Brian, that 7.6 million is 10% of our budget, did you mean to say?
It is 10%, yes, it is 10% of our budget, and it would draw down our reserves by that same amount. Pretty quickly, the legislature told us the GRB, that's not going to happen. We recognize that there needs to be more funding for the universities than that. They also said the governor's investment budget, which was $120 million, probably off the table as well. If that's off the table, the HEC investment piece is off the table. The co-chairs recommended $40 million, actually $40.5 million in funding for the Public University Support Fund. We now have a sense that that's likely to be a little bit higher than that, though we don't have total clarity on where state funding is going to be. That seems like the most prudent place for us to build a budget around, which is what you'll see later. In the next docket item, also is the right place for us to build a tuition recommendation around. And know that there may be, that provided the floor. If there's additional funding, we thought through how to kind of rebate a portion of that back to the students so that there was, there would be a benefit for them if there was additional state funding.
Brian, could you mention where the 40 and 120 come from? What's the basis for those figures in CSL?
Yeah, so the $40 million is what the state had determined is what they would call a CSL, or current service level budget. So that is what the state thinks that if they were to fund the universities at, it would essentially take care of our inflationary pressures. However, what that does is it pushes nearly all of the PEB and PERS impact on students. The $120 million is a number that the universities got together and said, what would it take in order for us collectively to keep tuition at or below 5%, that kind of threshold that the state has laid out before we need regulatory approval.
So the current service level doesn't include any of the costs?
So it includes some portions of it. We're treated for the state CSL calculation, they treat us like a third-party service provider and say, okay, you get inflationary increases, whereas they treat community colleges or the school districts or human services very differently, where they bring in the PEB impacts, the PERS impacts.
But our cost structure is still mandated by the same system.
Amen.
Okay.
And they are aware of that.
I'm sure they are, yeah.
And some of this is what I would phrase as the institutional resistance to some changes in governance that have happened over the last 5 or 6 years, in a way to kind of exact a little bit of revenge and in the starting place for conversations for us, but we're trying to work on that. So just to give this group a pretty wide variation in where we were planning around right now, or given the co-chair's budget, and assuming that OREC, the Oregon Renewable Energy Center, Sports Lottery, the Engineering Technology Sustaining Fund, all of those are different funding sources from the state that are important to us as an institution. Assuming all of those were funded at at kind of current rates, which that's the little red part of this, of the far right column at the top, we would assume that, or we would forecast about a $300,000 increase in state funding next year, and about $29.8 million in total state appropriation. So small increase, but not a whole lot. Part of that is due to the state distributes dollars in a 49-51 split. So they do a 2-year budget. You have 49% of it in the first year, 51 in the second year. So even with a $40 million increase, you're spreading that out over 2 years. And the first year being a little bit lower, it's pretty marginal. To talk about cost structure, and this is something that we as a tuition recommendation group looked at. You know, if we go back to the where do you spend your dollars, 23% of our total cost is fringe benefits. A lot of that basically split 50-50 there between PEB and PERS. On PERS, this graph that this applies to all of the PERS participants, and the exact rates are a little different for each institution depending on how many tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 folks you have. It's a good example, and this is true for all the different tiers. The growth in the past, you see in 15-17, that biennium, 17.5% on salary. So that's how much your kind of tax was or cost was. That jumped up to 20%. Our forecast for the upcoming biennium is 25%. So it's a 25% increase in our retirement expense. And we're expecting that to continue in the next biennium. There are some forecasts that starts to level out in the mid-2020s, so that assumes pretty strong market returns in perpetuity. So assuming that is not an accurate forecast, I'd expect that those numbers continue to increase over time. So we have a pretty significant cost impact. Our PEB benefits, this is the Public Employee Benefits Board. On healthcare, this is a graph of our healthcare expenses over time. This is driven by 2 factors. One is number of employees, but also the rate. So we now spend $19,300 per employee on healthcare. That's expected to jump up to close to $20,000 next year. I mean, these are very, very high fringe rates that we have. We do not have control over our insurance premiums. Those are things that are decided at the state level.
Brian, we should add that irrespective of the compensation, that is a flat amount at 0.5 FTE or greater. So it is not proportional. It's not an average figure. It's a fixed figure per employee, 0.5 FTE or greater.
And we have.
So somebody makes $25,000 half time. That person gets $19,000 health benefit.
We have a very low split with our employees, depending on which plan they've chosen, somewhere between a 97.3, where we pick up 97% of it, they pick up 3, or a 95.5. We are in negotiations with some of our unions, and one of the key pieces for us is we've got to increase that healthcare split so that there is a cost. Everybody is bearing their fair share of these costs.
I'm assuming something's preventing us from going out on that.
Yeah, we've. This is something that the universities have looked at and believe that we are pretty dramatically cross-subsidizing other agencies within the state because our health outcomes are much better than many of the other agencies. However, the state has been reluctant to allow us to even access the data so that we could explore those opportunities, much less make the jump.
We have brought it up in direct conversations with the governor as something that she would be willing to look into.
So every state employee.
Every state employee.
$19,000.
Yep.
And it's gonna be 20.
It'll be 20 here shortly. Yeah.
Wow.
Yep.
But you see the dilemma. I don't even know how to get inside the head of anyone that's trying to deal with this. When I look at it from the provider standpoint, what I see is an incredibly rich healthcare plan benefit that costs a whole lot of money and is sort of outside the market. For the people that have to make the decisions to change that are the ones that are the direct beneficiaries of that, and it's really hard to get them to do it.
It's kind of that conflict of interest.
It is a
Yep. Yep. No, that's exactly right. And by not having folks, by largely shielding employees, and this is true across the state, not just at this institution, shielding them from paying a portion of that, they don't feel the pain of that. So there's very little incentive to drive down that cost. So
I mean, you could probably go out and become self-insured and cover everyone and their families 100% for less.
We, 2000, maybe 11, 12, the university system did a study and expected that they could maintain benefits and save $60 million across the 7 institutions. That number is probably more towards $100 million now, just given inflationary pressures there. So holding benefits the same, we think we're not competitive. So given those kind of pieces that are driving at least major components of the budget, we started the tuition conversation, and our question was, well, what happens if you don't increase tuition? Just sort of to put stuff on the table, and we opened up spreadsheets and really just played. We spent a couple of probably frustrating hours playing around with spreadsheets, just trying to get a sense, again, what are those edge cases, and then trying to work those in. So if we didn't increase tuition at all, assume state appropriations at the co-chair's budget, that graph is our fund balance. These 2 dotted lines are the guidance that this board has provided to maintain our fund balance within the 10 to 15% of operating revenue range. We're this year above that. We're going to end the year at 17 to 18% fund balance, but that would decline precipitously over the next couple of years if we didn't make either decisions around tuition or pretty significant cuts in our operating expenses. So that, as we looked at it, probably didn't make sense. And then we just started layering on different scenarios. Okay, where are we today? What do different scenarios look like? So I won't go through each of these, but some of them included, a 9% tuition increase, which, and this, there are a lot of these tables, but, a 9% tuition increase, which is where we sort of got to as a middle case. What happens if you didn't have the Engineering Technology Sustaining Fund and ORIC? What's the impact of that? What happens if we start to make cuts as well, so that we're bringing down our operating expense? And that's the green line at the top. And something that the committee, and I've folks weigh in on this, I think the committee looked at and thought that it was important that over a couple of years, we saw, even if your fund balance declined in 1 year, that balanced out and began to rise. That it was important that the long-term sustainability was really important to the group. And so we wanted to see that in the second year of the biennium, that even if the institution needed to use some reserves, that it was put in a stronger position, within a couple of years.
So Brian, how was the 10 to 15% fund balance determined?
So that had, I was not here when the board made that decision. That historically had been where OUS and the university system had laid out their fund balance. Given that we are a much smaller entity, that number may be a little bit low because yeah, exactly. 1% is going to be $650,000, which can go pretty quickly. So we laid out a couple of scenarios to our students, starting with, and I'll ask you to weigh in on this, but we sort of wanted to draw some brackets and have some middle case and recognize that none of these were better or worse. They really were trade-off decisions, and we wanted our students to be able to weigh in on what those trade-off decisions were. So we had a relatively low tuition scenario. It became clear to us that you couldn't keep it below 5% without having draconian impacts on the institution. And then we looked at fairly high tuition with pretty high additional scholarships and additional remissions, and then looked at a middle case to understand, what kind of budget gaps that created, what remissions and scholarship levels that created, and what the tuition impact was. So I don't know if Jonathan, Jimmy, you want to talk about the scenarios or what the student feedback was?
Yeah, well, we have a slide for this. I'll wait for that, but yeah, we can just wait for that.
Okay. Great. And included, these are slides that came directly from the student budget forum or the student tuition forum. And so we laid out for them is, well, what's the impact, right? It's easy to put up a couple of numbers, but what are the likely impacts for those? So for scenario one, where you have low tuition but have to have pretty significant cuts to the institution, you're going to have lower tuition increases, not a lot of increase in scholarship funding, but you're going to have significant ongoing impacts, and there really would be no way to shield students from seeing that kind of impact in both their academic quality, course offerings. So you'd see a noticeable reduction in course offerings, probably no or very little equipment replacement. So we, as things wear out, we just have to manage. As you got to the middle scenario, you would see a higher tuition increase, but you'd also see an increase in scholarships and remissions. We would need to continue to bring back some of our course offerings and more actively manage some of those things that would impact students. However, we'd be able to largely shield from our student services from negative impacts. We'd have to continue with holding vacancies open, some selective staff reductions, and we'll talk about that later in the budget item. With high tuition, low aid, we'd see very little reductions or cost reductions. However, your tuition expense would go up pretty dramatically, and so that there's certainly some minuses that come along with that, and could broadly impact our enrollment. So,
then I can take it.
Great.
Cool. So throughout this entire process, we had four open forums on both campuses. So 2 up in Portland and 2 down here in Klamath Falls. And here's like a slideshow, and here's a slide of just like some of the concerns and points that we often heard from students. So the biggest one that we heard about was just like the general impact on if tuition were to increase, right? How it would impact students, how it would impact the institution and their classes. Another interesting point was that students wanted to see that if tuition were to go up, that we as an institution maintain our high quality programs and the high ROI. That's especially one of the biggest selling points for OIT. So students were like concerned that if my tuition goes up, at least keep the programs the same for the most part. And then students also wanted to see stronger programs and then more equipment. So making sure that our equipment is staying, cutting edge, state of the art. Make sure that if I'm paying more, at least I get like the good quality that I keep getting. And then students were kind of frustrated with the legislators about this whole like debacle. We had True Day a couple weeks ago, so a bunch of students from Portland and Klamath Falls actually made a trip to Salem, and we spent the whole day talking to legislators about the impact of tuition, the struggles that we have as students, and then just like and our institution as a whole. We also talked about increasing scholarships and readmission. So if tuition were to go up, we kind of try to assist students with that at least. And then also just a general support for the middle path. So when we had our forums, we had those 3 scenarios as Brian outlined, and we talked about how if students were to kind of take the brunt of like the fund increase and how that would kind of shape these students and how that would kind of impact department-wise too. So students obviously don't want tuition to go up, but department faculty also don't want to take huge cuts on their department because that means that the quality of programs will decrease too. So it's definitely like a big balancing act. And then we can go to the next one. Yeah. So pretty much some main student recommendations that we had was that we should try to increase remissions and scholarships with tuition going up. Another one is to continue investing in higher quality equipment to kind of keep our stuff cutting edge. Because again, tuition is going to go probably we probably can't keep it under 5% no matter how much we try. So we're trying to make like the better or worse situation. And then also establish a possibility for tuition to go down. So 9% is pretty much our like worst case scenario. And then that's kind of like a pessimistic view. So if we do get further funding from the state, then we can drop that percentage down.
Great. So,
Brian, if you will, I think it says here, how much additional funding from the state to get a 1% decrease in this rate?
Yeah, so we'll actually talk about it real quick. Yeah, but for every additional $20 million on top of the teachers' budget, we're going to reduce tuition by 1%.
Yeah, and maybe this is a good, the TRC laid out a recommendation, including that. I don't know if Jonathan, Jimmy, you want to walk us through what the TRC and ASOIT recommended?
Sure. I think at the end we recommended a base undergraduate tuition, so an increase by 9%, as we saw in the scenarios. And then as well as an increase to our differential, which impacts the health programs and the engineering and technology programs, from 25% to a 30% premium over our base. and then we increase our admissions by 1% of net tuition, and then we try to really focus on investing in replacing technology and upgrading our technology to enhance student life. And then as we just talked about, for every extra $20 million above the $40 million that the state would give, we would reduce tuition by 1%.
So just to highlight, really is sitting in that kind of middle scenario that was presented to the students by the TRC. So the process piece, the tuition recommendation committee kind of meets, works through the information, and in conjunction with ASOIT hosts a series of forums. The TRC's responsibility is to put together a final report and recommendation, and that's included in the board docket. We further, and this is something that doesn't happen at all the institutions, but we want to make sure that ASOIT is the kind of duly elected student representatives. They have their own opportunity to weigh in, and ASOIT on both the campuses voted to approve the same recommendation as the TRC. I don't know if you want to talk about what your deliberation was like with your kind of colleagues in student government.
Yeah. So at first, so initial talks with students, of course, were like, so why is tuition going up? Like, of course, like no one wants that, right? However, I did talk to my board a bit to kind of get them on board to really understand the full picture, because I understand that like it's a bit easier to understand and ingest all that information after you have like 24 sides and all that financial background and stuff. But for some people who might not be familiar with all the terminologies and whatnot, it takes a lot to kind of bring them up to pace. And then after kind of getting them up on that pace, they're able to understand it a bit more. Probably the biggest struggle that I had was talking to the students on campus though, because like up in Portland we have big competitors such as OSU and PSU, right? So they're like, oh, like why can't I just go to like those campuses too? But those campuses are also raising their tuition by a fair amount. So having those discussions were definitely the hardest thing, because for them like they're stuck in a situation where like tuition is going up no matter what school they go to. So as a college student, it's just hard when costs are constantly rising.
And on the other hand, on the Common Falls campus, what I found is that a lot of students here were actually understanding of why tuition has gone up and might have to go up. They really understand that education matters to them, and so they're definitely willing to bear the brunt of the increase in tuition as long as they have a great return on investments in the future. When I brought this to the board, all of the ASOIT Common Falls members were at both student forums on campus, and so they've also looked through they've also seen these slides, they've gone through all the discussions, and so they were also understanding and they understood what was happening, why tuition had to increase.
Give us a sense for attendance of the student forums.
On the Common Falls campus, I think for both forums we had roughly 50 to 60 people in attendance.
Yeah, and for the Portland Metro, we had 10 to 20. Attendance was kind of rough on one of the forum days, just because it was like a heavy snow day, so people couldn't really make it there. And then the other days, we had like a fair turnout. But most of it was just like face-to-face interaction though. For the timing of the forums, we'll definitely work on it for next year. But up in Portland, most of our classes are at 6 and whatnot. So the timing that we had was like at 3 or 4. So most students weren't even on campus at the time. So for the next time, we'll definitely schedule it a lot better. But most of my interaction with students were like kind of after the fact and kind of being like, hey, are you aware of this? Like, do you know about this?
And something that we did this year is we had a tuition website, so oat.edu/TRC, really easy and quick to get to, so that students who didn't go to the forums could get in and at least read the material, and there was a comment box so that they could provide comments back. We didn't get a lot of comments out of those, but we wanted to make sure that we're as transparent as possible. And at the end of the process, it's not included in the slide deck, but the last meeting of the TRC, what we did is went through and kind of evaluated what our process was and what are places that we could improve next year. And so one of those was, we learned in Wilsonville, we need to start hosting those forums a little bit later. So it's always a learning process to see how we can get better. One of the final stages is the president receives the report from the Tuition Recommendation Committee and from ASOIT, and then has a responsibility to make a recommendation to this board that is also found in a memo format in your packet. And to summarize those, the president has recommended the same increase, the sort of same structure that the TRC and ASOIT have put forward. It's really is a joint recommendation between our students, some of our faculty leadership on the TRC, and our president. That includes a 9% increase in base undergraduate tuition, increase in our differential tuition from 25% premium to a 30% premium. And then there are various other graduate tuition and kind of other small programs that aren't included in the TRC process, and the details of those are outlined in the packet, and we can go into those if you would like. Similarly, the president makes a recommendation on fees. These go through a similar process that ASOIT runs for establishing the incidental fees in Klamath Falls and the incidental fees in Wilsonville. So those are included in these recommendations. I don't know if you want to talk about the ASOIT, the student fee process at all.
Yeah, sure. So I chaired the incidental fee commission back in, I think, February. And so we had a committee of 7 students, including myself, made of with 2 students from each of our auxiliary departments, so our campus life, our athletics, and our college union. And so we had 2 representatives from each department, with myself, and we discussed what the fees go to, and how changing this fee would impact students. And so we looked at trying to maintain the service level of the student services on campus, and so we increased our fee from 360 to 367, so that we can cover our bases and to fully fund the 3 different departments on campus to make sure that the student quality of life gets maintained over the upcoming years.
Yeah, and for Portland Metro, for our incidental, we just kept it the same. So we consulted a lot with the faculty up in Portland, especially our dean of students. And looking at the incidental fees and where it's going, we see no need to increase it. And regarding our health services fee, that mainly goes to cover our counselors. So we have a student counselor up there. So students who have like mental health problems, who kind of need like someone to talk to, should be available. As of lately, her utilization rates are actually pretty high. So I mean, it's good that students are kind of using her, but she's just like swamped right now. So by increasing those rates, we're able to take another person on for part time to kind of take on more students. So yeah.
And I just, and I emphasize through both the tuition setting process and the fee setting process, really it's a joint effort. And the fee one in particular, very strongly led by our students. We see that as kind of their dollars to help figure out where they go. And I just again really appreciate the effort of both of you and your organizations. Talked about it, and I appreciate Chair Stewart your question around tuition reductions. And so part of the president's recommendation is a schedule of tuition reductions. Essentially, every $20 million above the co-chair's recommended budget, we would reduce tuition by 1%. And so what we've done here is laid out how much additional state revenue we would anticipate that would be for the institution, and then what's the cost of the tuition rebate. And as you can see, the tuition rebate ends up being more than half of for every $2 we'd get in, at least $1 or $1.10 would go back to our students throughout each level of funding. We want to make sure that our students that our tuition level is going down, and that there's also some dollars that allow us to offset expenses in the institution and to make investments in ways that serve our students.
Let me add a couple of things. One is, this is an unusual year in which the Ways and Means are currently talking about a 40.5, and you may want to mention about the significance of the 0.5 and how it may end up at the end.
Yeah, so this is important, and it's worth this group considering maybe even an amendment to the tuition recommendation. The co-chairs, typically would provide pretty round numbers. They did not provide a round number because they based it off of the calculation that the state had done. We have kind of calculated $20 million increments on top of that. However, this is a really formulaic structure, so if they were to provide $60 million and not 60.5, it would only the tuition wouldn't decline at all. And so there may actually be room here, as we kind of went back and looked at the motion, to think, well, maybe we just actually drop the 0.5s and call that 60. There's as we've had discussions with our legislators, they're dropping the 0.5, and what we don't want to do is get into a place where ours is a little bit out of sync, and our administration doesn't have the ability to make kind of what would otherwise be technical corrections that we'd all agree on. We just can't do that. We've got to have formal motion or formal, formal authorization from this body and the full board. So, maybe a suggestion there that we may actually, from the board, want to amend the motion to have that be round numbers.
So, ultimately, when we come to the motion, we may say, if we get at least 60 million more, this would be the reduction. If we get at least 80 million more, that's a reduction. Because just where the conversation started and how the Ways and Means is looking at it right now, there's a lot of flex. So that $500,000 should not become a technicality in terms of being not able to grant the 1% reduction to our students.
Yeah.
We have to have an emergency meeting of the board to make those amendments. If they were to give us 100 million instead of 100.5 million. So just wanted to flag that possibility.
Yeah, and there may be, as a caveat for this group, that we really can't control it. Right now, the final budget negotiations are happening, and the legislature can, at their discretion, kind of provide instruction, and so they'll do that through what's called a budget note, which is not does not carry the force of law, but I would not advise this body or any other state body to disregard a budget note. And so what they may do is say, we're going to give you X, and your tuition will be no greater than Y. And if that doesn't fit with the schedule, this body over the summer would likely have to meet again to make that adjustment at its discretion. You could choose to ignore that. I would not advise doing so. But just as a kind of warning that sits out there as the kind of final pieces there.
I also, Brian, want to mention here, when they give us 60, if they were to give us 60 million more or 80 million more, we have to know that our net proceeds do not go up proportionately, because we are really giving the advantage to our students. Whenever this extra dollars are coming from the state, we are going to reduce the tuition increase by 1%. So Brian mentioned at $40.5 million, we get only about $300,000 more than the last fiscal year to work with, while we have a $2 million increase in person PEP we have to deal with. But when it goes to 80, we may get another 300. When it goes to 100, we may get a net increase of only $90,000 in our revenue from the state. So it's important we don't scale up and add it by a certain percentage. It doesn't, the formulaic way of distribution works a little differently, because Oregon Tech gets a lot of its funding from who we are than entirely from what we do.
Formula, yeah. And, I think that, and we'll talk about it as we move into the budget conversation. Clearly, these are two parallel conversations on tuition and budget, but because of this reduction schedule, you don't clear a lot of net from additional state funding. And so we felt it was really important not to kick the can down the road and to be making, thoughtful, but at places aggressive budget choices in order to manage the operating environment, regardless of what state funding is. So there isn't a savior there. We've got to work through that regardless, and some of that is to spare students from the total price or total cost increase, and part of that is it's effective management. We just got to make decisions and move forward on that.
Well, on that note, I guess point of clarity and context, what I want to make sure I'm understanding here is, even if the state went to the additional 120 million that was talked about at one point, you could do a 5% tuition increase. You're in essence giving that rebate to the students, but it still contemplates a budget that is deficit spending, cost cuts, and dipping into reserves.
Yep.
Correct?
That's correct. It offsets it to some extent, but that's absolutely correct.
It seems like if that happens, in fact, the intent that the students carried into this process is not really being reflected in that because the institution now would be sort of worse off than had you just assumed just the 40 million, correct? So meaning that, you know, by actually reducing the tuition at those brackets, once you get into that upper bracket, it has potentially could have a negative impact on sort of the overall delivery of value to the students.
So we still end up a little, the net revenue, the net is still positive for us. It's just not hugely positive. So the 120 is a good example. So we have $2 million more, and this is all estimates. You know, those things will change as we get some final data in. But you'd have $2 million more in state revenue next year, but we would reduce our expected tuition by 1.4 million. So we'd be 600,000 to the good in that, but not 2 million to the good in that.
Okay. So we're never running negative with that.
No.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah, when all the dust settles down, we are roughly at 7% of the state's PUSF. But the thing we need to be vigilant about, for every 20 million more, we don't get 7%.
It's more 4 to 5.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's the one we have to be cautious of.
There are detailed tuition tables in the docket. Those are actually the kind of controlling piece that would be approved by this group. I did want to just highlight a couple of things. What is the actual impact? It would be about a $16 increase per credit or per term for a resident student. Per term, about $250 if they're taking 15 credits, and over the year, about $740. If they're a differential student, it'd be an additional $14 a credit hour on top of that, and I may have it written down here. For a differential student, they'd have an increase of $600, $630 over the year on top of it. So it's a very significant increase, particularly as you get into differential students. For our WUI students, that's about 1.5 times. For our non-resident students, and I'm sorry, Junman. The increase is pretty dramatic. It would be about $2,000 a year in increase. So this is significant, and we are very hopeful that the state will provide additional resources to bring that down. The HEC is laid out, and I'll walk through this fairly quickly, but it is important. The HEC has laid out a series of criteria of what they will look at when evaluating whether this tuition there is appropriate. That's what the law says. So they determine whether it's appropriate or not. And we structure the tuition setting process really to respond to these criteria and those that are outlined in what's called House Bill 4141, which is the law that kind of tells us how to do this. One of their first area criteria is, have we fostered an inclusive and transparent tuition setting process? So I know what you're hearing today and see in the docket is that process, and I think we've got a lot to be proud of throughout that. The second one is safeguarding access and support for degree completion by historically underrepresented students. So on this, we looked at a lot of different tuition scenarios. We focused on financial aid and remissions to ensure that we can protect those students that are most vulnerable. We've balanced tuition levels, remissions, and the kind of budget of the institution, which includes those areas around student services, including recommendations to increase investments from the president. You see that in the budget for a multicultural center for areas we're focused on students that need the most support. And lastly, but importantly, is we're able with this budget with this tuition level to maintain stability in our student services. So that's how we protect those students that will be most sensitive to the impact.
So just for clarity, you're pointing out what the HEC is going to look at in terms of the process that we followed, and do you feel that we have met all of those criteria?
I do. I do, and in discussions with HEC staff, there have been very positive in their assessment of our efforts, and they've been involved throughout. I just want to highlight the president's budget recommendation includes remissions of $4.5 million. That's about a $650,000, $700,000 increase. That is above what the tuition recommendation committee has recommended. So we have gone above what the recommendation of the committee is. remissions are actually involved in the budget recommendations, so they're not reflected in this presentation, but I just wanted to signal that.
Brian, is there a federal impact from federal financial aid that we've taken into consideration? Will Pell Grants be increasing? Will Department of Ed loan rates be increasing?
So the Pell caps are a federal question that we still sit underneath, but clearly there's how much financial aid is out there will matter. The loans, there are maximum caps, but again, those are often calculated on what's the cost of attendance. And so our cost of attendance numbers will go up, and that will kind of naturally work through the federal formulas. But the last question from the HEC is, what financial conditions exist that demonstrate the need for resident undergraduate tuition to be increased more than 5%? We've discussed those, and we'll discuss those further, so I don't think we need to go into it a ton of detail. HB 4141 lays out a couple of requirements, and we'll just work through this really quickly. It says that we need to have an advisory body. We have that. It outlines certain membership of that body, and that there are written documents outlining the process, and that's what the charge from the president is, this body's tuition policy. That we go through a training process so that our students understand the budget of the institution and what some of those drivers are. And I'd look to our students to ask whether they felt like that process was sufficient.
Yeah, quite a bit.
Also that we have a plan for managing our costs on an ongoing basis, and that we would reduce tuition if there's additional state funding. So you'll hear more about managing our costs in the budget presentation, and we've laid out a tuition reduction schedule. If the advisory body lays out an increase of greater than 5%, that it documents how that will impact certain groups of students, and we've done that through the focus of the body, or the focus of the TRC, our focus on remissions and scholarships and investment decisions our investment recommendations of the president. And then I believe the kind of last two, we provide meaningful opportunities for student government and students more broadly to participate in. I think that we've heard on that from involvement in student government and the student forums. And lastly, that we establish a website that has all the information on deliberations, and we have done so and widely advertised that. So, I just say we have, I think, both the letter and the spirit of the controlling legislation, and the letter and the spirit of the areas of focus from the HEC we have taken very seriously, and have had what I would characterize as an open and inclusive process. But
all right, I just want to add a couple of things. First of all, I want to recognize Dr. Foley, who has been an intricate part of the process, along with Brian, our faculty, and so on. And our students, they have been remarkable to work with in terms of the maturity they show, they understand the various dimensions of the push and pull of the various forces. So I want to thank the presidents that are here today. And this year has been very unusual. Even this is the second legislative session I'm involved with, and the dynamics is so different. Even when life is, for example, we are still bracing what are the budget notes we may have to deal with. There's a lot of lack of clarity at this time. So we have delayed this process. We requested the board to delay bringing you this recommendation until May, because we were hoping there'll be more clarity by the time May showed up. Unfortunately, we are not as better off as we hoped, but that is just the way it is right now.
Thank you. Thank you for the very in-depth presentation. I have a number of questions. So first to our ASOIT presidents, again, I want to thank you for your engagement. That's very important. It's critical to us that we hear your voice. Sometimes you can go through a process where the mechanics of trying to involve people are adhered to, but people still don't feel like they were heard and listened to. So how do you feel?
Yeah, I mean, I was also on the TRC last year, and so I think over the 2 years that I've been here and on this committee, I feel like my voice has definitely been heard. I put out a number of different suggestions. I think I've tried to run through my thoughts during the process, especially for me. Like, if you heard a numbers, I'll be paying an extra $4,000 next year. And so I really try to take that into account, how much it will impact not just our residents, but also our non-resident students as well.
Yeah, and then for me, I feel like my voice was heard a lot throughout this entire committee. I think according to the HEC, we only need to do like 2 meetings a year, right? We had like 8 or 9, so we had quite a bit. And then like probably the only thing that if I could do over again, it would be to reschedule the forum times. Just because again for our campus up in Portland, it's just the times that we had it just didn't work out for a lot of students. A bunch of students up there, they can work full time, so like just like their night class that like they come to after work. So just getting a better schedule would do better. But as ASOT, we tried our best to kind of make it aware and known. We put on like almost every single news publication that like we put out. Like we talked about tuition, getting students involved for True Day, going down to Salem to lobby for extra funding, and we try to be as transparent as possible. And I think we did a good job in that regard.
Well, that leads to my next question related to the process, which to me feels and I think was much more protracted than we've gone through in the past, but arguably more thorough and transparent. So how did you feel about the process, and do you have any other recommendations that we should be aware of that should be incorporated into the future? You mentioned the timing of the forums as one. Are there other suggestions or concerns with the process? I mean, 8-9 months, that's a lot of huge time commitment, but I think it's worth it.
Well, kind of to reiterate what Dr. Nagy said, and Brian, like this entire process was pretty interesting. Even now, we don't know exactly what the budget is, right? So for us, like we had to iterate the meetings, we had so many iterations just because we didn't know what the budget was going to be. So it's hard to make a recommendation when we don't know exactly what the ballpark numbers were. And then again, for me, like this was my first year doing ASLT, like understanding all this like budget stuff. So like I spent my first couple meetings like kind of learning all the mechanics and all the terminologies and whatnot. So we already took notes of that. So for next year, the committee will kind of have like a one-pager for like, hey, if you don't know what a HEC is, you don't know what like this is, right? You'll kind of know like going into it instead of like I remember the first couple of meetings I had to Google like almost every single term. I was like, so what co-chair are they talking about? Like I know there's like a bunch of co-chairs, but yeah, that could have been a bit better. But aside from that, it was pretty good, I think.
That's actually a great idea. Yeah, we throw acronyms around.
Yeah, there's so many acronyms. I was like, oh no.
And I think in terms of time commitment, I don't think it's too much of an ask because we meet like once every 2 weeks, and that's like 2 hours, and that's not a lot of time.
Well, again, thank you for your commitment to it. Do you have any recommendations to the board that we should also take into consideration as we weigh this tuition increase? To feel everything's kind of out on the table, or good to go?
I think it's just the focus on investment on technology. A lot of things I hear from students is that our stuff is old, it's not working, and whatnot. And so really trying to put our dollars into use in terms of reinvesting and making sure we're up to date with our technology.
Yeah, and then I kind of want to echo that sentiment too. Up in Portland, like we are a newer campus, so most of our stuff is a bit newer, so it might not be as dated as Climate for Fallen folks. But even though I'm the president up there, I definitely want to hear the voices of students down here too. So I mean, if tuition is going to go regardless, at least invest it wisely and ensure that our institution is cutting edge, because that's what people come here for, right? For the cutting edge technology, and so at least use the dollars wisely.
Great feedback, excellent observations. Thank you. I really appreciate that. I have a few questions for staff as well. What are the alternatives to continuing to increase tuition and or cut costs?
Yeah.
I mean, what do we need to have on the table so this isn't just a perennial process?
So, and that's the $64,000 question, or several $1 million question as it turns out. Yeah, I think there are a couple pieces. Some of them you'll see in the budget meeting later or the budget presentation later is looking at our cost structure and saying what are those areas in which we can more efficiently operate, or if we're not, or as we grow the enrollment base, not growing our so part of the answer to this is growing the institution. And I think that is for us to manage PERS and PEP. We've got to grow the institution and not grow our cost base, which means administratively watching our operations, and it means on the academic side of the house looking at kind of operating efficiency. That's a portion of it. Another portion of it is exploring kind of other revenue opportunities. And I think OMIC is a great example of this as an area where we'll be able to increase applied research, which will creates offsets that will bring down the kind of administrative cost that has to be paid for out of tuition. It's also true in clinic operations. We have a dental clinic, we've got the ABA clinic. Those are areas that are mission aligned, that enhance the education, but also create revenue streams for the institution. So looking for ways to create revenue streams given the assets we have that don't rely on tuition. I think we're going to talk about radiology equipment later. That equipment lays fallow for 3 months out of the year. Right? There's 3 months that could be revenue producing. And great ideas from Trustee Starr last night on that. Some around continuing education, clinical education for folks that are already in the workforce that look different than what we do today. So I think it is about let's explore revenue. On the other side of it, we've got to manage our costs so that we can grow without adding new people to support that growth.
And thanks to the board support, we have been able to invest and grow get after strategic enrollment management much more rigorously than what we could do on the margins. We really have to increase our development side. So, for example, this year we were able to bring almost $700,000 in equipment through fundraising, which otherwise would have come from operations. The last one, the advantage of applied research and innovation, is that our students and faculty will have access to equipment which we necessarily don't have to buy from our own operational dollars. The kind of WFL machine at OMIC, there's no way this university can afford to buy a $3 million, multi-tool head machine, which we will get to have access to, and we will get to acquire equipment which we can deploy in instruction from that coming out of grants. So that I think we just have to grow ourselves in different directions.
So, based on what you said earlier about PERS, PEP, and OWEB, I assume it's a safe assumption to assume we're going to be having the same conversation going forward.
It is. Our hope, and we've been, I think, pretty effective at this, is stabilizing tuition where we're seeing growth but not these huge jumps. And so what we have to some extent done is stair step. So this is a year in which the PERS increase hits us. Next year it will stay flat. So I would expect that next year tuition is at or below 5%. The year after that, you're probably going to have some of this conversation. The question is over that time, are we able to have enrollment growth materialize and manage our cost structure so that we can bring that delta down? But we will kind of every other year, there's likely to be a conversation like this as we're dealing with PEP and PERS. So the key for us is going to be managing that cost structure so that we're at least not compounding the issue.
I'm not as familiar with the actuarial tables, but isn't that true? The PEP PERS costs will go up until 2025 or 27, and then there could be a flattening of the gradient?
That is true on PERS. I have some skepticism on that because it assumes strong market returns through essentially ad infinitum. And
for a recession.
That's right. Yeah, there's a lot of conversation about 2020 walking into a recession. So at that point, those tables in the mid 2020s will probably be blown. But we've got a persistent problem.
My last question, how does this increase position us in both percentage increases and in real dollars with the other institutions we compete with?
Yeah, so there are 7 public institutions in Oregon, so I'll focus on those just sort of briefly. There are 3 institutions that will be below 5%, Eastern Oregon and Western Oregon, and Oregon State. Eastern and Western, pretty dissimilar institutions, not ones that we compete with. Both of those have had their enrollment, frankly, cratering. And so they feel like they have a pricing problem. Oregon State is increasing their tuition at somewhere just below 5%. And so in percentage terms, our increase is less. At an absolute cost basis, their price will continue to be higher than ours. So we are competitive with them. The other...
How did they hold it?
So, two things. They have an online program which spends out $100 million a year. And so they have shifted the way that they manage that online program so that it is so that they're able to capture the upside. Yeah, that's right. We are the last institution to not adjust our compensation model to match the one that they have for online. So that's an area of focus and discussion for us. The other piece that they have is they are making significant reductions at their institution to the tune of, I think, $11 to $12 million this year. Next year, that's going to be at least that, if not higher. So they're making some pretty large cost reductions for the institution, and so they're offsetting it in that way.
Well, even though it's a smaller percentage of their whole budget, still it is significant in terms of where they are choosing to reduce.
Yep. University of Oregon, Southern Oregon, Portland State are all increasing their tuition. All of those institutions are in double digits, so we are below those institutions. If we're gonna, I'd have kind of a pack of institutions below 5, pack of institutions in double digits, and we're kind of sitting at the bottom end of that.
Brian, what are the community colleges doing in response to the budget? Are they also increasing tuition? Are we going to be looking at enrollment declining and students heading to community colleges?
So I don't know. I don't know where they're positioning their tuition. I just haven't looked at it. The community college enrollment has been shrinking pretty dramatically. I think the nature of student who is likely to go, at least for a first-time freshman, to a community college and to a university are different. And so it's important for us to think about what are the kind of different lines of business to, probably a different way to say that, but part of what we offer is a residential experience, at least on the Klamath Falls campus. In the Portland metro area, we offer a university, which is qualitatively different than a community college, but I think we've got to be sensitive to what that means.
Well, two things. One is when governor gave her budget, she gave a flat budget to the universities. She gave $24 million less to community colleges. Now, I'm not sure exactly what Ways and Means has done or proposed so far. I'm sure they did something similar to the universities. Now, community colleges also have the Oregon Promise. There are other modalities in which they can attract students, but when the economy is doing well, most community colleges tend to have softer enrollment to start with. So it is just a combination of many factors right now.
Other questions? Students or staff?
So I had one for the presidents. First, I just want to mirror what everybody else is saying, that I really appreciate your guys' commitment and understanding and pragmatic approach and just maturity. It is pretty amazing because I was reading stuff and seeing stuff with the Portland State students, wanting to hang the board of trustees and stuff. So,
It's a good mental.
but I think I'm also concerned a bit, that when you talk about the level of participation of the students, 30 or 50 or that sort, with a student body of 3,000, how deep or penetrated do you think, through just discussions and website, and so how deep is the understanding of what you guys did and kind of the position or the environment that we're in now with the state? And
yeah, so I mean, I'll be honest, probably a lot of students, like, they kind of care, but I mean, for them, it's sort of like a hopeless situation, kind of, where, like, they're already so invested in school, so they have to finish it somewhere, right? So they're going to look at institutions they're going to go around. But when it comes to like this whole like tuition process, like of course they're gonna say they don't want tuition to go, but if you give them like reasons why like it kind of has to go, and you try to justify that, it's just like a really tough situation for students just in general. Again, like we try our best to kind of be vocal and transparent as possible, but I'll be honest, like a lot of students they kind of feel hopeless, and I'm sure students at other institutions feel the same way, especially up at CSU. They have like a double-digit increase, you know, like so I mean I've seen those articles too, and like it's pretty spooky. But I mean, as a college student, like that's just how we feel right now. Like we kind of have no choice though. Like we're too invested. Like it's kind of like a sunk cost fallacy, where like we're kind of too deep into it, right? I know, like obviously we do have some students like kind of like ourselves, like our student government, and then some other like active students who want to participate, who want to do this. But for some students, like they work full time, so like they can't really be too participatory, right? I mean, like it's just hard. Like you have a bunch of schoolwork, and it's just hard for them to really get engaged. If there are like a better means and ways that we can get better engagement, I mean, I'm all for it. But
that may be something that you guys can help us with is whether it's through whatever social media that I don't use at all. So we need your help. What other forums can we get information out and get feedback back?
Yeah, I mean that notion of social media definitely is probably a good idea. Like trying to utilize our Facebook or Instagram pages somehow, right? Yeah, because if I were to try to talk to people in Portland right now, like almost every single person has a part-time job or a full-time job, just because like living up there like so darn expensive, like not to add tuition and then time for other classes and whatnot. But people always find time for social media somehow. So if we can kind of utilize that and kind of make it more well known, and then kind of explain what's going on, that will probably get more engagement or at least some more feedback, right?
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
One thing I would like, Jin, did you have a comment?
Yeah, I just want to say I think on this campus it's slightly different. A lot of students here they kind of just like put their head down, study, get degrees, and move on. And so it's really hard to find engagement because all they're really trying to focus on is finishing the degree. Mm-hmm. And so if I talk to students, they're like, yeah, but it doesn't really matter to me. And that's like the end of that.
Okay.
I think it's an astute observation. I mean, we have, as an institution, predominantly students are very focused on what they want to do, and they're working hard to do it. And they know there's going to be a payback for that investment of time. I think what we need to make sure is there are multiple channels of at least asking. Yeah. And whether we get the feedback or not, I think as long as students feel there's at least the opportunity presented to them, whether or not they take advantage of it, that will go a long ways.
Talking about return on investment, I should mention to the students, Trustee Starr is a proud alum of Oregon Tech. He is from Klamath Falls, and today he's the vice president at Boeing, and delighted he's a member of our board of trustees. So, great role model. How are you guys?
On the soliciting feedback piece, I really appreciate the focus on that. And, it's something that we are constantly learning, and I want to thank ASOIT on both campuses, Nellie Stewart in my office, who really kind of quarterbacked the effort to get the word out, and the folks in student affairs. It's always a challenge, but I think something we're always focused on is how do you improve in that process. And I really appreciate at the end of the process having an opportunity to sit down with the group and to have kind of a no names attached survey at the end, folks to provide feedback to help us improve for next year. And so I think we've consistently improved year over year, and we'll continue to do that.
Yeah, because if you just run the numbers, just on that, I can't remember it was Peppers, but when you showed the year over year, a 25% increase year over year, and if that goes against the benefits of the 23%, that's just a gross 6% increase in those biennium, which is $4.5 million.
Yeah, it's huge. So the good thing, it's half of that because we get hit every other year.
Okay, so it's only 2.2.
Yeah, but still, that's exactly right. Like 3% increase every year, excluding
everything
salaries. Yeah, exactly.
It's just 3%. Yeah, or benefits.
Yeah. Yeah, that's
Yep.
Yep.
Again, we want to underscore our appreciation to all the things we really
Yeah, thank you, Brian.
Thank you.
Very grateful. I also want to thank staff. Everyone's been involved in this
process. I mean, having watched it now for several years, this is by far the best process we've gone through. And I really appreciate they've stepped up to meeting the HB 4141 requirements, but really improving the whole process of getting feedback in a very difficult conversation and making sure people feel engaged. So thank you. So at this point, we will entertain a motion on the subject of tuition and fee recommendations. The motion that we would be in a position to make is to recommend to the board to approve the 2019-20 tuition and mandatory fees as presented with the minor adjustment of that flexibility on the $500,000 state funding issue, so we don't have to revisit that, right? And that includes a recommendation to authorize staff to forward our request to the HEC. I captured that relatively correctly. Okay, we need a motion. Okay.
Second.
And a second. Is there any further discussion on the recommendation to the board as outlined? Okay, hearing none, all those in favor? Aye. And that leaves none opposed. So it's unanimous. Thank you. Thanks for your very hard work.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you, guys.
Great job. Best of luck with the meetup.
Yeah.
No, take advantage of that. I always call it the 6 months.
Really? Oh,
Yeah, no pressure.
no pressure.
Thanks again.
Yeah, well,
Thank you.
Oh, yeah,
Okay, sounds like we need a 2-minute rest. Keep it to 2 minutes.
I decided to go over Mount Hood and drive east.
Okay.
Down instead of that. I actually live in Glasgow.
Okay.
Yeah, I got hired into, like I said, it's
4.5, which is we're back, which is a discussion of the operating budget for fiscal year 2020. I don't know how you're gonna do it, Brian. We had budgeted 45 minutes. We're gonna have to take it down to 25 thereabouts, I think. So
We will.
try.
Yes, sir. So a lot of this, because we talked over a lot of the kind of background material, I think there are sections of this presentation that we'll just kind of walk through. So bear with me while I move over this. I do and would be incredibly remiss if I were not to thank Stephanie Pope and her team. Looks like Anna Clark from the budget office here, and Lori Harris, as well as all of the department directors, division directors, VPs who have been working on these budgets for a long time. So I'd be remiss if I didn't thank them for all of their work and the more work to come as we execute on what is a challenging budget. So the budget drivers, I will kind of move pretty quickly over that portion of this conversation because we've talked about a lot of that. Thank you for the recommendation on tuition. That means that the rest of this is largely factually grounded, or at least the revenue side will be factually grounded. We'll talk about how we've closed the gap in the budget, what are some of those investments, and then the path forward, and include Dr. Nagy in that process in particular. So I do just want to say these tight budgets are being dealt with other institutions across the state. So this is the same forces and the same issues that are impacting us are impacting other institutions. That is also true for the state. So the PERS and PEV are problems for us. Those are problems for the state budget. We don't have the advantage of being able to tax folks to take care of it. We have to compete for tuition dollars and to support our students. But those are issues that are true for us. They're true for school districts. They're true across the state. We have talked about where our revenue comes from and where expenses are going out. Talked about the kind of questions around budget funding. Net tuition, assuming an enrollment increase of 1% next year, which is where our enrollment management folks think we'll be. They actually think we'll be at about 1.5%, but budgeting 1% increase in enrollment and the tuition increases that this committee has recommended, and assuming the board approves later this afternoon, we'd expect just shy of $35 million in net tuition. That is net of remissions and scholarships or tuition discounts from the institution. On state appropriations, we're expecting just over $29 million, and that includes funding of the Engineering Technology Sustaining Fund, Oregon Renewable Energy Center, and the sports lottery program. The sports lottery sits in a different fund type, but matters because that offsets investments that we would otherwise need to make or cuts we would need to make in transfers to our athletics program. We have talked about the PERS increases. We've talked about PEB. Just to think about kind of which we move into assumptions. We've assumed an enrollment increase, 1%, tuition 9%, as we discussed earlier. Fee remissions increase $4.5 million worth of fee remissions. We'll talk about that in a moment. And then we are operating off of the co-chair's budget. That is kind of the safest place for us. We know that is what I call that the threshold. We're likely to be there. We may come in a little bit above, in which case there is some premium for the institution's budget, though a lot of that is rebated back out to students. So what are the things that are impacting our budget? And I think it's worth just a little bit of note on these. We built the budget as we were building tuition, and so those were iterative processes so that as we were seeing that budget is likely to come in above where revenues are, we're kind of iteratively cutting out of that to pull us back down. So these are rough estimates, but a good sense for the board to understand what are the things that are impacting our operating budget. So I'd actually start at the bottom. We heard this in our quarterly dashboard. We're expected to come in this year in our operating budget with a $2.2 million deficit. So that deficit doesn't disappear as we walk into next year. That continues to exist. And so the thing is, how do we start to close that along with other cost increases that are coming? We expect PEB and PERS increases combined to be $2.2 million. So that's the impact next year. Salary, there's the cost of roll-ups for pay plan increases over this year. We expect that to be about $500,000. we tend to do raises mid-year, so we do them effective January 1 or February 1, depending on folks' hire dates. And so then you end up with a full year impact the next year, and so we'll have the ramp up of that, and that's about $500,000. And then S&S, just assuming on supplies and services at 2% inflation, which is probably a reasonable amount, it'd be about $300,000. So those are pieces that are sitting out there as we look at the budget overall and say, okay, we're going to have to either accommodate or push back on these, some of which you can do, some of which you're going to have to absorb and make reductions in other areas. So how do we close the gap? So what we asked the departments to do is to provide to each of the VPs, the division directors, to provide to the budget office 3 scenarios. A 5% cut after absorbing PERS. So all of these is absorb PERS and PEB, and then deliver a 5% cut, a flat budget, and a +3 budget. Again, we have pretty large instability in where we expect both tuition and state appropriations to land. So we wanted some scenarios of how they would do that, and then what the impact would be on students, on attainment for the institution. To start out the budget build process after receiving those, we started at a flat budget at the 0%, and that gave us a $6.8 million deficit headed into next year. So we clearly needed to close that gap. A portion of that, our budget owners in one part of their budget were pretty successful in getting it to 0, and then ballooned out costs in other areas, but those costs you have to pay for too. So that's about $3 million of that 6.8 or $2.9 million. That's
Brian, I think we should be clear. That is when we just took what they proposed as 0% budget, right? So I don't want the 6.8 to be looked at as a deficit.
Yeah.
It just based on what they asked at 0%, that is really where we ended, and we had to address the budget, pull it back.
That's exactly right. This is sort of where we started in order to work ourselves to work it down. So starting with that $6.8 million gap, we have instituted, or the recommendation is a 2% across the board cut. That would be given to the division directors at the vice president level. They can move that amongst their different division or their different departments and units. So I wouldn't expect that actually is across the board. I know for finance and administration, some areas will have a much larger cut than that. Some of them will not. Some of that due to the flexibility, some of that due to the kind of strategic focus. I would expect that the other vice presidents would do something similar. That netted about $1.3 million in savings. We expect to accrue $2 million worth of salary savings next year. Historically, those have sat in the departments and they've been allowed to offset some of their other expenses with salary savings. We will pull those back centrally this year. So those, we're working on our budget system now to see whether we can do that monthly. If not monthly, we will do it quarterly. So that way those dollars are not sitting out there. We're centrally accruing those in order for us to hit our overall budget. It's kind of net reinvestment of various contingencies of about $250,000 that we kind of, there's going to be things that come. So I want to recognize some of those and put them in. We had additional position reductions, and those are new requests that had been approved previously or replacement positions for current vacancies. And so some areas, some divisions will be taking a larger than a 2% reduction in order to fill those vacancies. If a vice president feels that that position is really important, great. They're going to have to replace that savings elsewhere. And then the last portion, $2.9 million, is in kind of a sub portion of the general fund, the special general fund. This is where folks ballooned up costs to offset the 0. We pushed that back down to the prior year. Said, nope, you've got to hit your current year budget, the kind of this year's adjusted budget. That nets $6.7 million in savings, but left us with about $100,000 worth of operating deficit. This is a challenging budget. I can't I don't want to belabor the point, but this is going to be a hard budget for a lot of our units to hit. There will be material reductions in many of the areas. in order for them to hit it. We are working on the academic side of the house to get full year plans for what courses will be offered so that we can price out adjunct and overload and online expenses and understand whether they can or will hit that and then how to manage against it. So I do just want to know, this is a difficult budget for our folks to hit. This is absorbing, and I think it's important. PERS and PEB, $2.2 million. On an operating basis, we're coming in with essentially flat or $100,000 reduction. So we're absorbing $2.2 million worth of PERS and PEB in cost decreases across the institution. That's difficult. And so that is the kind of left-hand series of information here. State funding, remissions, giving us net revenues of $67 million, essentially right on the head. On expenses, labor, plan savings, other expenses gives us a total expense of $67.1 million, net of $100,000 in operating, or net loss of $100,000 in operating. And then we have a series of strategic investments. And this is something that FOAC Chair Richard Bailey brought up earlier today, that each of the units were allowed to, in a strategic investment forum, given the opportunity. If you have things that make sense to invest in, you think will help grow the institution, and are aligned with the principles that this board laid out in January about what we should prioritize in the budget development process, bring those forward. We allowed FOAC an opportunity for the students and faculty and administrators on that group to read through those, get an understanding of them, provide a recommendation to the president, and for the president and senior staff to take a look at those, provide their feedback and thoughts, and bring some of those forward. And so we're also proposing $1.7 million worth of investments that we believe will support the ongoing growth of the institution and, in fact, create additional growth over time. So what are those investments? I think it is important to come back and reflect on the principles that this committee and the board adopted in January to outline the budget development process. The first is that we prioritize recruiting and retaining students, recruiting, retaining, and graduating is very important. The completion of students is important. Second, that we invest in our faculty, staff, and infrastructure to support student success. We've heard a lot about that regarding technology from our students earlier today. Third, that we align programs and initiatives with industry demand. That is the kind of core feature of our institution, and that needs to continue to be a priority for us as we build budgets. Four, that we manage operating efficiencies in all aspects, whether that's administrative or academic portions of the institution, and we're focused on driving up efficiency to allow us to grow without concomitant growth in expenses. And then lastly, but importantly, and you see this in the budget, is managing short-term uncertainty and focus on long-term sustainability. So where we need to make tough decisions, we make those tough decisions, but it positions us to be sustainable over the medium and the long term. Those strategic investments, to lead those off, is an item that we'll hear about immediately after this. Is a major investment in radiology equipment. We have equipment there that is no longer functional or increasingly unreliable. And so this is the largest single investment. The first year includes this assumes a 5-year lease, 5-year capital lease, and $100,000 worth of capital expense in the first year to remodel and install. I'd expect the capital expense at the front end could be lower than that, but I don't want to have to come back. The launching of a multicultural center. This is something that we talked about in the tuition process. We have an increasingly large number of students of color on campus that we have not traditionally had, and that we need to focus on serving. And so this is one of those areas where it's a key investment for us to serve our students and to serve future students more effectively.
This will include more than students. We are going to look at faculty, staff, and students.
A focus on military outreach. This is both to support our current veterans, but also, and importantly, to start new initiatives focused on veterans and those that are currently serving our armed forces. Resources to start the doctorate in physical therapy program, as well as support for the Rural Health Initiative It's important to note some of this includes support for the ABA clinic, some other areas. It does not net against some donations and investments that have been made from folks in the community. So there is actually some offsetting revenue that's not included in this. It's not included in our revenue. And Stephanie's head is nodding, so that's good. The increased capacity, our website is in a place where it needs to be redesigned and rebuilt. I probably won't go through all of these in detail. Increasing investments in prospect research for our foundation, and we talked about this and how do we create additional resources for the institution. This is one of those that I would classify as getting smart in some of those operations, setting aside dollars for strategic planning, campus beautification, as well as some additional investments for our enrollment management unit. So we've recognized as we've increased dramatically the load of applications that have come through, that's stressing some of their processing functions. So we need to make investments in their processing functions. So that's a good investment to make. Yes, ma'am.
$150,000 for a website?
The total project is actually $200,000. We have received competitive quotes, and we are in the process of evaluating. Dai, could you talk very briefly about this?
Sure. $200,000 was our price tag that we put on the contract, and that's kind of the generally what it does cost for a website new project conversion, as well as complete redesign and really new technology behind the site as well. We did get 13 quotes, and we're reviewing finalists now, but all of them came in pretty close to the 200,000, some over that amount as well. So it is a high price tag, but it is the main portal through which our students find us and contact us. So it's very, very important for both admissions and marketing to our students. But it's not a low cost.
I've never heard of such a thing. What is the cost driver for something like that?
Pardon me?
What is the specific cost driver for it? Is there some sort of database management thing?
Yeah, it generally takes about a year, and it's really putting all new types of technology behind the site, the ability to edit it, to collect data from the site to help us with our leads that we can then get into the new CRM that admissions uses to do their work. So it is a highly technical type of work.
But I have all of that, and I did not spend $200,000 on that. That seems outrageous.
Yeah, it is very high, but it's pretty standard. We actually contacted a lot of other universities. Portland State's recent revamp cost $380,000. So we're a large institution. There's a lot of pages on our site, and it's a very, very important marketing tool. It's not cheap. We did it internally about 6 years ago, but it basically took our staff away from doing really anything else. And it's not, we've heard from external consultants and folks internally, it's not doing what we need it to do. So I truly believe that it will return on investment very, very quickly for us in terms of bringing in additional students, and helping also with the SEO, the search engine optimization, and all of that. So it is not cheap, but it will be worth the investment. I think we can get a pretty quick ROI on it with getting more students, and we can get you an estimate of what we think the increase in the numbers of students.
We'll certainly take your advice now, and we will look into it actively. If there are cost drivers we can avoid.
What do you think, Ray? And I can send you the.
Have you heard of something like that?
You don't ask me what IT selling costs. Yeah, it's just if it takes a year, it's probably 2,000 hours type thing, and you just think what it takes somebody to code that, and if you link all the analytics into it,
Will we be cleaning the website before we bring a consultant in to rebuild it?
Did you spend
Yeah,
$200,000 on the site?
I've been doing that for about a year and a half.
Because I know I have redundant pages.
Yeah, no, Bob is doing housekeeping and cleaning and working on some SEO now.
Will that offset the cost of the final project if we give them a cleaner product to start with?
Content. If we had the new content, we would add another 75 to 100K over that.
Thank you though for the input.
No, it's a good question.
I still don't know.
No, that's, wow. You guys are absolutely sure you completely vetted every option for, I mean, that just seems, I don't know.
I was gonna ask a question about the X-ray, so I don't know. if
Yeah,
you're
no,
just-
go ahead. Go ahead.
So-
I have a question about that too.
It says replacement, so what's the, is it obsolescence? Is it the stuff doesn't work? Is it, it's 10 years old? Is it,
Yeah, the equipment at this point, and see if I get some nods, and we'll talk about this in depth shortly, but it's 12-year-old equipment, and we bought it refurbished, so it's likely older than 12 years. And we now have several machines that are down, so we're cannibalizing a few to keep the others running. So it's time to replace them. The lifespan on that probably should be 8 to 10 years stretching, knowing that we're not in a clinical environment, so we can kind of push a little bit. And I looked at Trustee Stewart, who may have a better sense on the time of those, but the equipment's down, or it's obsolescent and it's falling apart.
We've gotten more life than you could reasonably expect out of that equipment, probably because of Jason and others bubblegumming it together.
okay.
It's probably doubled its useful life.
Yeah, and we have, I kind of signal this and say letter, we're in negotiations on the final price for that equipment. And so this is, that number there is enough for a 5-year capital lease. We'll finance that either with a bank, they've got a financing partner, or through the foundation. I mean, I'd rather provide the foundation the interest expense and use a portion of their fixed income portfolio. So we're working on that, but it's also where it doesn't make sense to outlay the full amount in a year.
I guess I had a question around just generally how this is sort of viewed. So, I mean, we've had equipment there, it's basically aged out. How does this, I can kind of look at this as it's sort of straddling the fence between some sort of like deferred maintenance type of category.
Yep.
I don't know if I could sort of really make the case that it's an investment, except for the fact that we have to, we have programs around this that need to be supported. So can you give me some feedback on as to?
Yeah, so there are a couple pieces, and I think your point taken. I think that you are correct in as much as this ought to be an operating expense. And I think on the healthcare side in particular of our programs, they are equipment intensive, and that equipment does not have the kind of duration or lifespan that we would expect on the engineering side of the house, where you buy a piece of equipment, it may not be state of the art, but it gets the job done for the next 20 years, whereas in a manufacturing environment, that may not be sufficient, but for an engineering environment or education environment, probably is. Healthcare side, the replacement cycles are much shorter, and that equipment ought to be viewed as an operating expense where we're putting dollars again, either we're leasing it and putting dollars against it there, or we're buying it and setting aside resources so that we can replace it. We as an institution have not done that. Period, full stop. Nor have we had a capital replacement plan for any of the academic equipment. And so this is coming forward an issue where we're at kind of the end of the lifespan. It's falling apart. If we don't do it, we're going to end up shrinking our cohorts in order to kind of keep what we have. What we have done to offset the revenue is the department has volunteered to increase their cohort sizes, and I think the dean is working with them to drive that up even more so that they can offset the additional cost of this. So that's where you start to get incremental revenues out of it. What they volunteered takes care of about half of that cost. So the question is, what do you do with that other half of the cost? And so this is a part of the partnership that we're focusing on. We'll talk about it in a little bit, is to increase over the summer continuing education. So we do very little to none of that now, and frankly can't on the equipment that we have. It's so out of date that there's no market value there.
Mm-hmm.
with new equipment, that puts us in a position and the expertise of our faculty to do continuing education. Without commitment from the department to drive up the revenue, we've got to figure out what to do, and not just over this, but over the long term, including the mind ray leases that we signed last year for ultrasound. Are those being used over the summer? And the answer to that is no. And so this is where we've got to rely on our departments to be much more entrepreneurial and revenue focused.
So, I mean, if you look at it kind of that way, I mean, this really should fall under the operational budget, or at least the piece where you're utilizing that equipment during the year, and then any marketing or any additional sort of staff you need in order to operate over the summer, I would consider sort of more on the investment side.
Yep.
You see what I mean?
Yeah, I do.
You know, the other challenge with stuff like this is what else is coming up, because this is only one set of things, right? So if we haven't at all addressed this, where this falls in that bucket makes a big difference, because we're going to continue to see those things popping up, I would assume, right? Stuff doesn't last forever. What is sort of the general thinking and the plan behind that? Because if we're running deficit budget and we're sort of mixing up our, you know.
May I add something? First of all, you are correct. Most of it should be under operations. And we are beginning to work with the deans more intentionally to have an equipment plan. That's why even in fundraising, the foundation apparently used to struggle getting a list of equipment that could be potentially.
I remember talking about that, yeah.
And things are getting better in that front. One of the challenges for all technically intensive programs is this. In many schools, really, the deferred maintenance on equipment gets ignored. This is where we have to look at it in different dimensions to be able to do innovation and applied research. Now we begin to bring equipment through grant funds, which you otherwise don't have to spend operational dollars on, but we need a better plan. But there is an advantage keeping it as an investment in terms of presenting our case to HEC and others. In speaking as we did, and thank you again for making the time to be at the True Day, we are able to tell the governor this is almost 2% tuition at Oregon Tech for them, and they talk about 5%, 8%. We are saying 1 year of 5 years is almost 2% tuition at Oregon Tech. So it helps to highlight our importance of the mission, but I cannot disagree with you.
And that's what I mean by straddling the fence a little bit, because it's not really one or the other. Because, you know, when you think about having old, aged out equipment that, you know, you've got 3 out of 5 that are down most of the time, that impedes your ability to deliver the content and to sort of attract students potentially over time, right? Because they go and they do a tour of radiology here and they do a tour somewhere else, you know, and that sort of makes a sort of impact on.
So in the interest of time, your point's right. We need, in business world, we fund depreciation and have a plan for replacing equipment. We don't do that here, don't have that opportunity. So we're leveraging this investment in a couple of strategic directions. And it gives you some talking points at the state level. We're going to hear a little bit more about this if we get to the last agenda item. So I'm going to ask that we move on.
In the last line, there's a minor typo. That's 6,000 is supposed to be miscellaneous. Yeah, it just got copied over. So.
This kind of rehashes what we saw earlier on kind of the operating and investment side. And with that, I would turn it over to Dr. Nagy to talk about the charting course forward.
This kind of addresses Mr. Gomez's question, what are we going to do moving forward? We could have come to the board requesting a larger deficit, which we did not want to kick the can down the road. I think we need to really look at both the revenue and the expense side. We wanted to put in some cost controls. We have been getting more engaged looking at the historic investments. We went back to 2010 when our enrollments were beginning to grow. With on-campus service, there was more addition to staffing, and then we haven't stopped growing the staffing even when enrollment softened. So we need to really look at it in the longer term. So that's the reason not only we involve the VPs, the functional VPs in building the budget, now they are going to be given the opportunity to make the adjustments and manage that budget going forward. And then we are going to be looking at each of the position requests with a special group at the presidential level. So we are very thoughtful in growing our staffing at Oregon Tech over the next 2-3 years. We need to do that in order to be able to invest in other areas. Next slide, please. I think that goes to the first point. Growth in employees, both administrative and faculty, have far outpaced enrollment over the past decade. In terms of the number of students we are servicing, we should also look at the funding models in response to Trustee Starr's question. Brian talked about how an Oregon State manages their online versus us, and we are among the last. We need to really be looking for solutions in many areas. We are investing in enrollment growth, and today we have good things to share with you, which you will hear in Erica Wett's report, and Grace and others are doing a much better job of engaging schools in academic agreements. We need to manage the student cohort sizes and plan our classes more carefully, so that in trying to help a student, we don't offer two students. One non-traditional student in Portal Metro asked me, I'm very happy to be in a 3-student class, but how do you manage it? Because she comes from the business environment. She while she is benefiting, she's also asking those questions. And again, investing in initiatives with partner institutions so we don't duplicate costs, whether it is Southern Oregon Higher Education Consortium or one of the other institutions. We are looking for avenues in which we can cut down some of the administrative expenses. The state keeps imposing more and more requirements. In some places, these are the right things to do, whether it is cultural competency training and so on. For example, we are speaking with President Scott on how we can use her investment and kind of co-share that kind of training modalities on all of our 4 campuses. So we are looking at it every which way. So that's kind of going forward. This year we have just taken the difficult decision of not kicking the can down the road, really stop looking at all of the dimensions to address some of the things you talked about as well. And that's the end of our presentation.
Okay, so we have a budget that we need to take action on, either send them back to the drawing board or recommend it to the board. Any further questions about the proposed budget as it stands? It's not good, right?
Page on page 121, the far right column should be chopped off. That was the sort of bad pull on the adjusted budget. So it should look like what's in the quarterly report, which is at $1.8 million there, not 4.9.
So in summary, difficult budget, going to be challenging to hit, in spite of the fact that it dips into reserves and has a 9% tuition increase and is a deficit budget.
That's right.
It's very difficult decisions, but the worst thing we can do is to delay those decisions and not deal with them right now.
I'll make the motion to recommend the budget to the full board.
Thank you.
I will second.
Thank
Mike
you.
and I have a staring contest right now. Who's going to do it first?
We have a recommendation we have a motion to recommend to the board the 2019-2020 Education and General Operating Fund budget as has been outlined by Vice President Fox. Any last minute discussion or questions? Hearing none, all those in favor of the motion, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Hearing none, we will recommend that budget to the board.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I know this is a very difficult decision. We appreciate your support.
Tough budget. Tough times. We do have one last potential action item. And it relates.
Right, yes, you got it. It's on the third one in that.
Relates to the diagnostic imaging equipment that we referenced in the strategic investment budget. I want to give you a little context for this, and then we've got some representatives of the department and biomedical engineering staff that are here to answer questions. As referenced, the equipment is extremely old, and it has to be replaced if we're going to maintain that program and potentially expand it, which staff and faculty are willing to do. The negotiation of the purchase price of equipment like this is very difficult when it's being shared in a public forum. And so I've discussed this with Brian, and we're going to be careful to ensure that the committee understands what's being done, but we're going to shy away from articulating proposed prices. And what will be presented to you is a recommendation to approve staff negotiating purchase of this equipment in excess of $1 million, which will then be funded most likely through an operating lease. And the committee has the assurance that the final negotiated price will then be reported back to the board and the chair of the finance committee to close the accountability loop. Does that make sense? So it's a little more cryptic than you would normally see for an action like this, and that's the rationale behind it. Okay, Brian, are you kicking it off?
Yeah, I will. Thank you very much, and I'll invite up our representatives from the department and the college. We'll note that we got 2 L's in Don McDonald, but I forgot to change the title of the slides, or the title of the slide deck. So,
so in this sense, we can balance it out.
And Austin Group, our meeting was supposed to end right now, so we'll kind of move pretty quickly through this. I think the focus at the front end of this is to provide, I think, answers to a lot of the questions that were asked earlier about what is the equipment, the nature of the department, what's its condition. And so just nod at me when you want me to switch a slide, and I'll advance it. So,
okay, a little bit about program history. The radiologic science programs was started in 1952 here at Oregon Tech. It was a certificate program at that time, and it evolved into an associate's degree, and then now we have the baccalaureate degree. The reason we have the baccalaureate degree is in our curriculum, we not only teach the primary modality, which is radiology, but all of our students, they get the didactic training that is required by our registry body for post-primary modalities, CT, MRI, mammo, and interventional radiography. Our students on externship, they get a 12-week rotation into one of those modalities. So what ends up happening is over 50% of our graduates are prepared to be dual certified upon graduation. So this means that they'll be in general radiography, they sit for that national registry exam. 30 days later, they can sit for CT. This helps us to hit 2 niches in the state, well, actually in the Pacific Northwest. One niche is for your urban settings, where they're looking for specific MRI techs or CT techs. And then in the rural setting, which is where we really like to go, we have dual certified techs that can operate 2 different modalities, which makes us more marketable in that setting. With all of the medical imaging programs, 4-year degrees. We have a pre-MIT year, which is going to be all the prereqs for the programs. The students will then select the program that they'd like to apply for, and then they go through an interview process, and we look at a weighted GPA. Once they're selected into the program, they are on campus for 2 years, and then they spend their 4th year out on externship for 11 months. Our acceptance rate for qualified applicants has been right at 72% over the past 10 years. And so we've been accepting 48 students a year. However, in order to help the sustainability of the university and to try to meet the need of more techs out in the field, we increased our enrollment to 52 this last year. We have the potential to increase to actually 56, and that would not add any extra teaching load. With the new equipment, we would be able to, like I said, increase our enrollment to 56. In the event that we do not get the new equipment, we would have to lay out approximately $100,000 to do some modifications in the lab and then have General Electric engineers come in and assess and try to repair the equipment we have. If that happens, we would have to have a decision to move forward with new equipment next year. If we don't, the 2019 cohort will be the last cohort to go through the radiologic science program. We have a very good retention rate, only at 2.2% attrition. So we do graduate our students. Little history. One of the things I asked myself is, if I was on the board, I would ask, why is this so urgent? Well, 10 years or 12 years ago, 2007, that's when Martha Ann Dow building opened, and that's when we got our equipment. The question the faculty asked at that time is, what is our equipment sustainability plan? And the reply that was given was, we'll worry about that later. Okay, so we are later. In fact, we're real late. Our first two machines went down in 2009, and they were unrepairable. So what Jason has been doing over the past 6 years is he's cannibalizing those machines to keep the other 10 running. And we started talking about a replacement plan in 2013. This went up to as high as the provost level, and then we were tasked with drafting strategic plans for our department and our programs. And we did that in 2015, and we put in a plan to replace 2 machines each year, and we just rotate and have fresh equipment in the lab at all times. So we'd have a variety of pieces of equipment. I'll let Jason take over here.
Just to kind of put a picture in your guys' mind, we have a lab that consists of 10 machines that we're considering replacing. 2 of them are non-functional at this time. Quite a few of them, if not all of them, are very temperamental at this time. So, like Don said, we're stealing from Peter to Rob Paul, or whatever that saying is. We're taking from one to keep the other one running. And where it's benefited over the past, well, I've been at OIT 6 years, over the past decade, is that we haven't had to put any money into service contracts. We haven't had to put any money into large ticket repairs. So we can look at it now and say, well, this is a $2 million project now, but over the past 10 years, we've really saved a lot of money at the expense, kind of the students having to use a less amount of equipment. So if we go to the next slide, these are just a few pictures. We'll just kind of go through the next 4 slides. It's stuff that you guys will see that the stuff's just breaking down. And I can take pictures of equipment that you can see, but from a board standpoint, from a technological standpoint, the things are failing. Circuit boards, fortunately, we haven't had any tubes go out yet, but tubes are a real high-ticket item. So needless to say, this stuff is outdated as well. And Paul hit it right on the head when he said this stuff has gone twice its life limit. 6 years is pretty typical for an imaging device to last for a number of reasons, wear and tear, but also from a technology standpoint. When you start going a decade behind, and we call ourselves a state-of-the-art institution, we're not really offering state-of-the-art education anymore when we're using outdated equipment. So from a twofold standpoint, we need to do this. And I'm going to let Don talk about the new equipment that's proposed.
What we're proposing is that we would have all these rooms would be digital radiography, in other words, DR. So it is the latest technology. We'd be proposing to have 5 identical standard rooms. And then we would have 2 trauma bays. These would have your standard overhead tube crane, and we wouldn't have any tables in the room. And the reason for that is we would be able to teach surgery trauma in this sort of setting. We'd be looking, some of the newer technology that's out there now are U-arms and straight arms. I won't get into the weeds on that. I do have a picture. You can go ahead and go to the next picture if you'd like. But this would be the standard room here with an upright buggy table and overhead tube. We're looking at getting a portable X-ray machine as well to better prepare our students for externship. The U-arm right here, this is some of the latest technology. Many clinics and actually hospitals are moving over to this type of room, and this will enhance the learning experience of the students because we're trying to teach them to think outside of the box. Take the basics and then let's move to using a wide variety of equipment. Go ahead.
So this, let Dan and I talk about this. What we're focused on with the vendor is more than just a purchase of the equipment, but actually it's more integrated partnership, something that we're focused on with most major contracts that we sign now is actually how do we, particularly with equipment manufacturers, how do we expand this and make it a more sticky relationship? And that has got to be beneficial for both parties. Key piece for us, medical equipment supplier is on the healthcare side is great. That's a piece of equipment that we use to deliver education. That's also a piece of equipment that was built by somebody. And we have a whole nother side of the house that are the people that build things. And so we have traditionally on the engineering side been highly focused on aerospace defense. It's actually an opportunity for us to move into a complementary manufacturing area around medical device manufacturing. So the benefits to us, this is an investment that's needed to sustain the marquee program. It allows us to integrate with a major supplier and can start to create partnerships on the engineering and data sciences, IT side of the house. For radiologic sciences, John, if you want to talk about this, or Dan, the kind of partnership that's been discussed.
We have been in discussion with Konica for quite some time about this partnership. They really do want to have their brand with us and our brand with them. And they can provide us with continuing education that we can, where they would give us industry presenters that can present the latest and greatest in technology if we were to hold conferences here. They'll be providing materials that will enhance our curriculum on campus here. And then we are serious enough about this partnership that we're going to be scheduling quarterly meetings to look at ways that we could explore other opportunities for the partnership. One that came up yesterday morning, and I didn't send this to you, sorry, Brian. Core Medical in Seattle, Washington, they will be doing the install on this equipment, and they have also actually started looking at a non-paid internship for engineers with their company. And we do have the potential of them participating with us in the summers with continuing education.
I think this is something that was brought up earlier from this group on how do you use an investment like this to enhance revenue channels. And something that we have not done is continuing education despite having significant capital assets that could be used for those. Konica Minolta is a major supplier for healthcare systems, so for us accessing their client base to become a provider of choice for continuing education is an avenue for us to enhance the revenue channels.
Need to move quickly, Brian.
Yeah, so on the engineering side of the house, this is something that was brought up by Konica Minolta in sort of the first piece. they are looking for interns to source skilled talent, whether it's mechanical, electrical engineers, computer science, information technology, operations management, all of those areas in which they have needs, in which the engineering side of the house fills. There's also potential on the data science program, if that were approved by the board. That's an area where they have interest as it relates to precision medicine. So this is kind of a more holistic partnership. As Chair Stewart mentioned, we are being a little vague on total price in as much as we're in active negotiation, and I've been very frank with Minolta. If we can't hit a price where it makes sense, then we will scrub the project, and we'll go through another process and see what works. We are seeking approval for the president designee to enter into a contract in excess of $1 million and to enter into financing arrangements associated with that. The remodel, we've set aside dollars in the budget that was recommended by this committee to do the remodel and capital enhancement that's needed for the area. The financing, we're expecting a 5-year term with a capital lease with a kind of $1 purchase at the end for the equipment. We would expect that the equipment would last us 8 to 10 years, so several years after we're done paying for it, in which we can extract value. I think the important part for us is to have the discipline to set aside resources at the end of that time, so that we're not in the same position we are today. That is an operating expense. And in order to execute this, we would enter into a sole source agreement, kind of wrapping in the entire partnership as well as the equipment.
And I want to re-emphasize what Brian said in terms of the vendor. Unless they come to some favorable terms in many dimensions, this is not, we want the ability to really renegotiate on who will provide the equipment and what the cost would be.
So with that, I will open the floor for questions or discussions.
I would be amiss if I do want to recognize the faculty and staff of the department for the great job they have done. Last week I was in Reno and visited hospitals and met many of our employers. They just could not say enough good things about our graduates. So the credit goes to the faculty and staff of the department.
Trustee Ross.
One of the points in your presentation said that if this purchase doesn't go through, 2019 is the last cohort. So is that saying that if we don't get new equipment, Oregon Tech ceases to have a radiology modality?
I got something stuck in my eye tooth. I can't see what I'm saying. What would happen if we do not move forward with this summer is we would have to work the equipment over, and we could only accept 36 students next year to reduce the load on the equipment. If we did not get new equipment next year, then our equipment will not make it any further than that.
We would be down to 4 medical imaging modalities, losing the flagship program that draws students nationwide.
Yes.
That's at the cliff. What happened? That's worst case scenario.
We're a spot that we'd reduce the potential. We've taken 56 students, but now we're at 36, so we've lost 20 of our enrollment. And then, yes, we would be finished.
Who also pay full tuition during their extern year, even though the students aren't on campus using resources.
And so that would be 1 year with a smaller cohort, right? And then we would replace it next year and move up to the larger cohort. So there is, you operate through a year. I think we would work with the department to see if we could minimize the reduction in students next year, and work through it, knowing that that's suboptimal, and then come back with a project next year. The question is, do you do it this year? Do you do it next year? And the question as I look at it is, can we secure sufficiently advantageous pricing this year to move forward? If we can, then we'll negotiate, go out and look at other options over the coming year and do the replacement next year.
The credit goes to the department that retention rates are very high. And once a student starts, they finish the program. That is to be noted. And once a student interest wanes, to rebuild it back will be harder. So we need to be looking at it short term and long term.
From an outreach perspective, I have high school students asking every week, can we come in and view medical imaging? So that becomes a really hard message to say, sort of, you can come see some medical imaging.
The failure rate of our equipment right now, there's a lot of things that happen inside the machine, time key chips, things like that, that only GE can come in and do the repairs and recalibrate with their laptops and their proprietary software. There's only so much that I can do to device to keep it running, and the rate in which it's failing and the amount of parts, just strictly parts and labor from GE, they're charging about $400 an hour. Now, every visit, whether we have it with the mammo or an x-ray room, it comes to around $10,000 per repair. And we have, with every machine that needs a new time key chip and needs a new calibration, we're talking about 10 rooms that are going to need something over the next year. So we're looking at putting $100,000 into old equipment that we're going to replace in a year, or we can buy new equipment now. It just, to me, it seems silly to throw good money at old equipment that's going to be of no value in a year.
I think arguably we've been doing that for several years now.
Agreed.
Now, while the timing is relatively unfortunate, at some point you got to bite that bullet.
The only question I would have, I absolutely see the need of. It's funny, Grace, that question you said. It's like, yeah, I can show you a museum, because it doesn't look like what you see out in the clinics now. Is challenge you to how efficient can you get, and how can you increase the size of the classes, or the, you know what I mean, when you get these, because these are new whiz bang. Jason will have a job because they'll all be working. You know what I mean? So that's my only challenge is
That's a very good question. We used to accept, it was pre my time, I've only been here 12 years. We used to accept a higher number in the cohort. And what ended up happening is we'd saturate the market. We'd saturate the market with these techs, and then there wouldn't be a need for the techs. And so what would happen is our enrollment would ebb and flow. And so what we've worked on for the past 15 to 20 years is keeping homeostasis with, what is industry need, and we're going to fill that, but we don't want to saturate. Otherwise, short term we can take and increase our enrollment, by quite a bit, but what's going to end up happening is, if we look long term, it's not going to pan out. And that's a very good question.
And part of, I think, the other side to that is defining what our market is, and expanding that from purely an Oregon-based market to a Western U.S. market or a U.S. market, including on the enrollment and attraction of the students, so that we can send them back to Fort Worth, teach them here, send them back to Fort Worth, so that we're not saturating the local market with local students, or Austin, or wherever that is. So part of that is, nobody wants to go back to Fort Worth. But part of that is a self-definition as a very regionally focused program or regionally focused institution to
I understand the rationale at this point for a sole source conversation because of the partnership aspects that you're trying to develop. My question is how you landed on Konica Minolta to begin with. What's the rationale behind that, as opposed to having packaged, here's what we're looking for, a partnership, now let's let multiple companies come to us and say, here's what we would do?
Well, that's a very good question. And what happened is, when we first had the Martha Ann Dow Center, there was a partnership that was developed between Toshiba ultrasonic machines and Oregon Tech. Well, two of the lead representatives from that endeavor, one of them now is with Mindray and the other is with Konica. So they understand what our needs are and what we can do for them and what they can do for us. So that was the driving force. They actually reached out to us rather than us reaching out to them.
What we're finding, and we kind of experienced it when we did the Mindray negotiations, is when GE came to the table and Toshiba came to the table, those companies have changed over the years, especially Toshiba, to where when they presented their equipment, they said, here's our stuff, you should just buy it. As opposed to saying, here's what we can do for you, here's what you can do for us. It's like they didn't understand the partnership aspect of it anymore. So Conoco was eager. I mean, they were knocking on our door. They're in constant contact with us. They've had people come out to visit the site to see if it would work. You can see that there's a hunger and eagerness on their end to make this partnership work. And from a lot of aspects, it will work well for them. We're down in the summertime. Why not use labs for them to do training? We don't x-ray people, so we can be a beta site for their new software. So it's kind of a give take on the relationship, and Conoco stepped up to the plate and really they were eager to go forward with this. Thank you.
I have a question. Does the motion that's on that we're gonna try to take today on the negotiation side of purchase this equipment, is that flexible enough for you to be able to kind of work out the best arrangement? Meaning there's lots of different ways to acquire equipment. There's different types of rentals. There's agreements to sort of renew that equipment every few years if you're going to be offering continuing ed to, other professionals and things like that. I don't want to hamstring you into a certain type of structure.
It is.
Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And this, the motion is very, very broad, so it would allow for essentially all options on the table.
But it does say purchase, right? Which may not. I mean, that may not end up being the best structure. Meaning, you may opt for a rental kind of agreement ongoing that keeps fresh equipment in there. I don't know. Yeah,
so we could adjust that. Appreciate that, Sandra, to acquire. So if that's a part of the motion, it's just to acquire.
I just want to make sure that we're not, that you have the ability to kind of work out what's best.
I appreciate that, and it does not box us into a supplier.
Yeah.
So if we're not able to reach, if we're not able to reach terms with Conoco Minolta, that's fine. We'll continue otherwise, and so we're not tied in any way. So
Do you want me to read the motion?
Yes.
The motion is to recommend the board authorize staff to enter into a partnership agreement through a sole source contract to acquire radiological sciences equipment in excess of $1 million, enter into a financing agreement, and report back to the committee and board the final negotiated price. I think that encompasses everything that was stated.
And everybody understands why the need for sole source as opposed to an RFP, just because of the time frame over the summer. If we're going to go through this, it needs to be installed. We don't force students start coming back in the doors, right? So our lag time or the time for install. And if we did RFP process, that pushes it back, and then we start installing.
That's fine. If they want to do it, you guys are comfortable with that particular supplier. I mean, we want what's best for the students. I mean, I do.
We do want to negotiate the best terms for our new tech and our students.
And to clarify, this committee has authorization. This isn't a recommendation to.
Yep, it is a recommendation.
It is a recommendation. Any other questions on what the motion would be or suggestions? Okay, hearing none, we'll entertain a motion to the effect that Sandra just read.
I will motion.
Second. Moved and seconded to recommend to the board authorization of staff to proceed with acquiring the equipment under the terms as outlined. The appropriate flexibility. Any further discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion passes. We're out of time. Do I have a prerogative to say there is no other business?
You will not entertain it.
I will not entertain any new business. And I'm fired. Good with adjournment? Okay, we'll adjourn this committee. Thank you, Jason, Don, Dan.
Yeah.
Thank
you for coming and for your presentation and your work, and thanks for keeping it together this long.
And I won't be out of job.
Maybe let's have more compliments.
They're actually sending me to tech school. There's a tech school in that's involved in the contract. But I got other buildings like.
Yeah, we'll keep.